Welcome back. Hey, my dear friends. In 1492, 3 small ships crossed the Atlantic, searching for Asia. But what they actually found would reshape the world in a far darker way than old legends admit. Columbus did not step into an empty land. He entered a living realm of islands, cultures, and people with their own deep histories. Almost at once, curiosity began turning into possession, gold fever into captivity, and wonder into conquest. This is not merely a story of discovery. It is the story of a mistake that grew into an empire. Before we go further, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. If you enjoy history and mystery like this, then listen. The sea is black before dawn, and the ships cut through it like 3 small wooden doubts. Around them, the Atlantic breathes in long, invisible swells, lifting the hulls, then letting them fall back into darkness. No coast is visible. No harbor light waits ahead. There is only water, wind, and the thin confidence of a man who believes the world is smaller than it truly is. For weeks, Christopher Columbus has sailed west from the Canary Islands, carrying a promise that sounds almost impossible. That Asia can be reached not by following old routes around Africa or across the eastern Mediterranean, but by striking straight through the unknown ocean. On paper, the plan has a clean, almost elegant shape. In reality, it is salt, rot, fear, splintered timber, and men watching the horizon with growing suspicion. Every morning, the sun rises over the same emptiness. Every evening, it sinks into the same unbroken ring of water. The crews of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria are not sailing through a blank space on a map. They are sailing through a place Europeans do not understand. And the difference is enormous. Columbus does not think he is entering a new world. That idea is not yet available to him in any meaningful way. He believes he is approaching the outer islands of Asia, somewhere near the rich lands described by travelers, merchants, and medieval geographers. His mind is full of spices, gold, emperors, ports, and the chance to stand before the rulers of the East as the admiral who opened a western road. Yet the ocean beneath him is not the narrow sea he imagined. His calculations are wrong. The earth is wider than he thinks. Asia is farther than he believes. And between Europe and Asia lies an entire hemisphere of lands, peoples, forests, islands, mountains, rivers, and civilizations that his maps cannot properly contain. This is the first dark truth behind the voyage of 1492. It begins not with discovery, but with a mistake. A mistake large enough to carry 3 ships across the Atlantic, and violent enough to reshape millions of lives. Before we go deeper, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story that follows is not the simple tale often told in classrooms or painted onto old murals. It is not only a story of courage at sea, though courage was certainly required. It is not only a story of navigation, ambition, or royal sponsorship, though all of those mattered. It is a story about what happens when a desperate Europe reaches outward, when a man mistakes one world for another, and when that mistake becomes an empire. The Atlantic in 1492 is not empty, but to Columbus and his patrons, it functions as a barrier between hunger and opportunity. Behind the ships lies a Europe full of pressure. Kingdoms compete. Merchants search for routes. Christian monarchs dream of expansion after centuries of war against Muslim powers in Iberia. Gold is not mere decoration. It is power, credit, armies, influence, and survival. Spices are not luxuries in the modern sense. They are high-value goods tied to status, medicine, preservation, and long-distance trade. Whoever controls the route to them controls more than flavor. They control wealth moving across continents. Ahead of the ships lies something far more complex than Columbus expects. In the Caribbean, island societies have their own histories, alliances, rivalries, farming systems, spiritual worlds, and maritime networks. The Taino and other indigenous peoples are not waiting in some frozen silence for Europe to arrive. They are living in motion, planting cassava, fishing reefs, traveling between islands, making tools, raising children, telling stories, burying their dead, and reading the sea in ways Columbus does not understand. What survives in the record suggests a world deeply adapted to its environment, not a world without history. But in the dark before contact, none of this has yet entered European awareness. For Columbus, the horizon remains a promise. For the men aboard the ships, it is becoming a threat. Sailors know the ocean as few others do. But even experienced sailors fear distance when distance has no familiar limit. They worry about food, water, weather, and whether the winds that carry them west will ever allow them to return east. Some accounts of the voyage were shaped after the fact, and scholars still debate details of the crew's mood and resistance. But the deeper fear is not hard to understand. They are far beyond the normal roots of their world, and their commander's certainty rests on numbers that are dangerously false. Columbus tries to control fear with calculation. He records distances. He watches birds. He studies floating vegetation. He reads signs in the water and sky, turning every reed, branch, and cloud into evidence that land must be near. At times he appears to keep different reckonings of distance, one for himself and one for the crew. A lesser-known detail that reveals how fragile authority can become when leadership depends on hope. The exact meaning of these records remains debated, but the pattern is telling. The voyage is not just a physical crossing, it is a struggle over belief. Then, in October, signs multiply. Birds appear in greater numbers. The sea carries hints of land. The crews feel the atmosphere change before they fully know why. The Atlantic, which had seemed endless, begins to behave like a threshold. Somewhere ahead, beyond the darkness, there is shore. Columbus still thinks he is nearing Asia's island fringe. He does not know that the land he is approaching belongs to a world with its own ancient migrations, its own languages, its own sacred geographies, and its own future about to be violently interrupted. That is why the moment is so haunting. It is often remembered as an arrival, but it is also a collision waiting to happen. On one side are sailors carrying banners, contracts, royal authority, Christian symbols, and an appetite sharpened by years of European competition. On the other side are island communities, with no reason to understand the scale of what these ships represent. A few wooden vessels do not look like the beginning of catastrophe. They look strange, perhaps alarming, perhaps fascinating, but not yet like the front edge of disease, forced labor, conquest, and demographic collapse. No single explanation fully accounts for what follows. Columbus is not alone responsible for every force unleashed after 1492, but he is one of the first instruments through which those forces arrive. His voyage opens a door that cannot be closed again. Behind him come rival explorers, priests, soldiers, settlers, officials, merchants, enslavers, and men who speak the language of salvation while searching for wealth. The crossing becomes a corridor. The corridor becomes an empire. The empire becomes a wound, remembered in different ways by different peoples. As the first landfall nears, the story narrows to an almost unbearable point. A light is seen, or perhaps later remembered as seen. The ships move carefully through the night. Men who have spent weeks staring at water now strain toward darkness, hoping for the shape of land. The future is still unwritten, but only barely. In a few hours, Europeans will step onto Caribbean sand and claim they have found what was never lost. They will name what already has names. They will describe people before trying to understand them. They will search for gold before grasping the human world around them. And beneath all of it lies the central contradiction of 1492. Columbus crosses the ocean, believing he has reached the edge of Asia. But But the real history begins in the space between his certainty and the truth. In that space, wonder turns into possession. Curiosity turns into extraction. A voyage praised for courage reveals the machinery of conquest already forming in miniature. The dark truth does not begin with monsters. It begins with ambition, error, hunger, and a horizon that seems to promise everything. Europe's hunger for roots is not born in a single palace or a single harbor. It rises slowly from the crowded markets of late medieval towns, from the ledgers of merchants, from the prayers of kings, from the fear of rivals, and from the long memory of wars that have made geography feel like destiny. By the time Columbus begins asking for ships, the western voyage is not just the dream of one stubborn sailor. It is a symptom of a continent looking outward with restless impatience. The old roads to wealth run east. For centuries, luxury goods move across tangled networks of land and sea, passing through many hands before they reach Western Europe. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, silks, dyes, pearls, and other precious materials travel through Indian Ocean ports, Red Sea passages, Persian Gulf routes, Mediterranean cities, and caravan roads linked to Muslim, Asian, and Mediterranean powers. No European kingdom fully controls this system. Venice and Genoa profit from parts of it. Islamic empires and merchant networks shape much of it. The result is not a simple wall blocking Europe from Asia, as later legends sometimes suggest, but a costly web of intermediaries that ambitious monarchs would dearly like to bypass. This is where the story grows darker than a simple tale of exploration. Exploration is never only curiosity. It is also accounting. It is the desire to remove the middleman, to seize the route, to command the price, to turn distance into profit. The evidence remains incomplete when it comes to every private calculation made in royal courts. But the larger pattern is clear. Portugal has already shown what state-backed oceanic expansion can do. Its sailors push down the coast of Africa, charting winds, building forts, trading in gold, ivory, and enslaved people, and searching for a sea road around Africa to the Indian Ocean. Each voyage is presented as courage, faith, and science. Each voyage also expands a commercial machine. Spain, or more precisely, the newly united crowns of Castile and Aragon, watches this with interest and anxiety. The year 1492 is not an isolated date floating in history. It is a year of endings and beginnings. In January, Granada falls, the last Muslim-ruled kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. For Ferdinand and Isabella, the conquest marks the completion of a long Christian military struggle that later generations will call the Reconquista. Though scholars still debate how neat or unified that idea really was across centuries, what matters in 1492 is the atmosphere it creates. Triumph, religious certainty, royal confidence, and a political appetite for the next frontier. The same year also brings the expulsion of Jews from Spain under the Alhambra decree, a brutal act of religious uniformity that tears families, communities, and intellectual traditions from the kingdom. This belongs to the same world as the voyage west. A monarchy that seeks unity at home also seeks glory abroad. A state that defines itself through conquest and conversion carries those habits across the sea. The connection is not mechanical, and no single explanation fully accounts for Spain's imperial turn. But the rhythm is hard to miss. Victory in Granada frees attention, money, and imagination. The frontier moves. Columbus enters this world at precisely the right and wrong time. Right because the Spanish monarchs are newly willing to gamble. Wrong because Portugal is already closer to the real prize. Portuguese mariners are nearing the route around Africa that will soon connect Europe to the Indian Ocean by sea. Columbus offers Spain a shortcut that seems bold enough to change the balance. He does not propose sailing into an unknown hemisphere. He proposes reaching known riches by an unexpected direction. The idea is attractive not because it is modern, but because it seems to solve an old medieval problem with oceanic nerve. Behind the royal decision lies a mix of faith and finance. Columbus promises access to Asia, possible alliances with Eastern Christian rulers imagined in European tradition, opportunities for conversion, and above all, wealth. Gold matters constantly in his thinking. It appears not only as treasure, but as the fuel of crusading dreams, royal projects, and social advancement. This is one of the lesser-known tensions in the story. Columbus's mind is not divided between religion and greed in a clean, modern way. To him, and to many of his patrons, the two can reinforce each other. Wealth can fund holy war. Conversion can justify expansion. Empire can be made to look like providence. The Atlantic islands already provide a grim rehearsal. Before 1492, Europeans have colonized or exploited islands, such as Madeira, the Azores, the Canaries, and Cape Verde. These islands become laboratories of plantation agriculture, forced labor, conquest, and ecological transformation. The Canary Islands are especially important because they show how Iberian powers treat indigenous islanders when expansion meets resistance. The Guanche and other peoples of the Canaries are conquered, displaced, enslaved, and absorbed under European rule. What happens later in the Caribbean is not identical, but it does not emerge from nowhere. There is already a template. Claim the land, convert the people, extract labor, remake the landscape. So when Columbus sails west, he carries more than maps and instruments. He carries the habits of Atlantic expansion. He carries legal assumptions about possession. He carries Christian universalism, sharpened by recent war. He carries the commercial hunger of monarchs and investors who expect returns. The voyage may look tiny against the ocean, just 3 ships moving through uncertain water, but behind those ships stands an entire structure of ambition. The Mediterranean world also presses on the story. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is often oversimplified as the single event that forces Europeans to seek new routes. But that version is too tidy. Trade does not simply stop after 1453. Merchants adapt. Goods keep moving. Yet the Ottoman rise does alter the political imagination of Europe. It reminds Western rulers that Eastern routes are vulnerable to rival powers, taxes, diplomacy, and war. It strengthens the appeal of direct access, especially for kingdoms outside the most powerful Mediterranean trading networks. Scholars still debate the weight of each factor, but together they create a climate in which the ocean begins to look less like a boundary and more like a possible weapon. This is why Columbus's proposal survives despite its flaws. Learned critics can see problems in his calculations. The Earth's size is not completely unknown. Ancient and medieval geographers have offered estimates far better than his. Columbus shrinks the globe by relying on favorable numbers and confused units, making Asia appear reachable across the Western Ocean. His error is not that he alone believes the world is round while others think it flat. That popular myth is one of the most persistent distortions of the story. Educated Europeans generally know the Earth is spherical. The real argument concerns size, distance, and survivability. Columbus is wrong, not because he is too enlightened for his age, but because he is too confident in a dangerously convenient mistake. Yet convenient mistakes can be powerful. For Spain, the risk is limited compared with the possible reward. The crown grants Columbus titles and privileges if he succeeds. But ships and crews are a modest investment beside the imagined wealth of Asia. The monarchy does not need to be certain. It only needs to believe the gamble is worth taking. In that gap between uncertainty and desire, history shifts. There is also a psychological hunger at work, harder to measure but impossible to ignore. Europe at the end of the 15th century is becoming more capable of projecting power beyond familiar shores. Ships are improving. Navigation is becoming more systematic. Mariners understand wind patterns with growing sophistication. Written accounts of travel circulate alongside myth, rumor, and exaggeration. The world feels larger and more reachable at the same time. That combination is intoxicating. It invites awe, but it also invites possession. The dark truth behind the voyage, then, is not only what happens after landfall, it is already present in the reasons for going. Columbus sails because Europe wants routes, and routes are never neutral. A route is a line of movement, but also a line of control. It decides who pays, who profits, who is bypassed, who is conquered, and who is made visible only when useful. The Atlantic crossing begins as a search for Asia, but it is powered by a deeper question. How can wealth be reached without permission from those who currently stand between? That question turns the ocean into a corridor of empire. It makes distant peoples into future subjects before Europeans even know their names. It makes geography something to be solved, claimed, and monetized. When Columbus finally receives support from Ferdinand and Isabella, he is not simply being trusted as a visionary. He is being used as a possible answer to a strategic problem. And so the ships that leave Spain carry a world behind them. Granada's fallen walls, expelled communities, Portuguese rivalry, Atlantic plantations, crusading dreams, merchant arithmetic, royal ambition, and a map of Asia distorted by hope. The voyage may begin at sea, but its roots are buried deep in Europe's hunger. That hunger will soon meet islands where people are not looking for Europe, where the sea already has meaning, and where the first European words of possession will fall upon lands that are anything but empty. Columbus enters history not as a clean symbol, but as a man full of contradictions, and the more closely his life is examined, the harder it becomes to separate daring from delusion. He is often remembered as if he arrives fully formed at the Spanish court, holding out a map and asking for 3 ships. But the real figure is stranger, rougher, and more restless than the legend. He is a sailor shaped by the commercial Atlantic, a self-taught reader of geography, a man hungry for rank, wealth, and recognition, and a believer in signs who can turn uncertainty into personal certainty with almost frightening speed. He is born in Genoa, a maritime city where the sea is not romance but livelihood. Ships, contracts, cargoes, debts, and risk are part of the air. Genoese merchants and sailors move through the Mediterranean and beyond, working wherever profit and patronage carry them. Columbus grows up in that world of trade and navigation, though the details of his early life remain partly obscure. What survives in the record suggests not a university-trained scholar, but a working mariner, who gradually builds a private universe from experience, rumor, borrowed books, and ambition. He sails, trades, survives shipwreck, and eventually attaches himself to the expanding Portuguese Atlantic world. Portugal matters because it gives him both knowledge and frustration. There he sees how oceanic enterprise can raise men and kingdoms. He also sees that the Portuguese crown already has its own route to Asia in mind. His great idea is simple enough to sound brilliant: sail west to reach the east. The problem is that it depends on a world that does not exist. Columbus does not invent the spherical Earth, and he does not need to prove it to educated Europeans. The old myth that everyone around him believes the world is flat belongs mostly to later storytelling. The real issue is distance. How far is it from the Canary Islands westward to Asia? How much ocean lies between? Can ships carry enough food and water? Can a crew survive the emptiness? On this question, Columbus builds his dream on error. He underestimates the size of the Earth and overestimates the eastward reach of Asia. He leans on calculations that make the ocean crossing seem much shorter than it is, blending sources in ways that favor his desired answer. He uses ancient geography, medieval travel accounts, and confused measurements to compress the world. The evidence remains incomplete about every step in his reasoning, but the result is unmistakable. His Asia lies far too close to Europe. If the Americas had not existed, his voyage would likely have ended not in triumph, but in death, by thirst, hunger, or mutiny somewhere in an ocean much wider than he imagined. That is one of the most unsettling details of the story. Columbus succeeds because he is wrong, but wrong in a way that collides with land by accident. His confidence is not vindicated by reality. It is rescued by a continent he does not know exists. This does not make him foolish in every sense. He is a skilled seaman. He understands winds, currents, and Atlantic island routes well enough to attempt something terrifying. He knows how to present a proposal to power. He can read the desires of kings. He offers not just a voyage, but a package of rewards: gold, spices, souls for conversion, prestige over Portugal, and perhaps a western link to the imagined wealth of Asia. He frames himself as the necessary instrument of a providential design. In an age where politics and religion are deeply entangled, that matters. But Columbus's ambition is unusually sharp. He does not merely ask to be paid. He demands titles: Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor over lands he expects to reach, and a share of the profits. These requests are not modest. They reveal a man who does not imagine himself as a temporary employee of the crown, but as the founder of a dynasty. He wants his descendants to inherit the rewards of his vision. He wants the sea to lift him out of ordinary status and place him among the great men of empire. For years, this ambition meets resistance. He brings his proposal first to Portugal, where experts are skeptical and the crown is focused on the African route. He then seeks backing elsewhere, moving through courts and patrons, waiting, arguing, recalculating, presenting the same impossible shortcut with the intensity of a man who cannot let it die. Scholars still debate how different royal advisors weighed his plan, but they seem to have understood something crucial. The voyage was not impossible because the earth was flat. It was dangerous because the earth was large. Columbus's numbers were convenient, and convenience can look suspiciously like wishful thinking. His persistence is almost admirable until one considers what he means to do if he succeeds. Columbus is not simply seeking knowledge. His writings and actions show a constant interest in possession, gold, command, and the use of human beings as instruments of empire. This does not make him unique among European expansionists of his time, but it does strip away the innocence often attached to him. The voyage is not a neutral experiment. It is a bid for power. There is also a religious intensity in him that should not be dismissed as decoration. Columbus reads his own life through providence. He believes God has chosen him for a role in sacred history. Later, he will connect his voyages to apocalyptic expectations and the liberation of Jerusalem, imagining that wealth from newly reached lands might help fund Christian ambitions in the Eastern Mediterranean. To modern ears, this can sound like contradiction: gold and salvation, enslavement and conversion, prophet and prophecy. To Columbus, these can occupy the same mental world. No single explanation fully accounts for his motives, because his motives are not clean. He is pious and greedy, brave and cruel, observant and blind, practical at sea and fantastical on land. This mixture makes him dangerous. A purely cynical man might adjust when reality contradicts him. A purely scientific mind might revise the map. Columbus often does the opposite. He bends evidence toward belief. When he reaches Caribbean islands, he insists they belong to the outskirts of Asia. When he meets people who do not match his expectations, he fits them into categories useful to his mission. When he finds little gold, he imagines more nearby. When his authority is challenged, he responds with severity. The man who can cross an ocean by trusting signs is also the man who can misread an entire civilization because he needs it to fit a promise. His obsession grows from books as much as from sea experience. He annotates works of geography and travel, absorbing accounts of Marco Polo, classical writers, church authorities, and medieval legends. These texts do not give him a modern map. They give him a world alive with marvels, kingdoms, monsters, riches, and divine purpose. Asia, in the European imagination, is not merely a place. It is a storehouse of wealth and wonder. The farther a land lies from familiar Europe, the more easily it becomes a screen for desire. Columbus projects onto the westward ocean the riches he expects from the east. He does not sail into emptiness. He sails into an argument he has already settled in his own mind. This is why his miscalculation is more than mathematical. It is moral and imaginative. He reduces distance because he wants the world to be reachable. He reduces unfamiliar people because he wants them to be useful. He reduces lands into claims because his contract with the crown depends on finding territories that can be named, governed, and exploited. The same pattern appears again and again.
The world as it is matters less than the world his ambition requires. Yet it would be too simple to portray Columbus as an isolated monster. The darker truth is that his flaws match the needs of his age. His confidence is useful to monarchs. His hunger fits the appetite of empire. His religious certainty fits a kingdom fresh from conquest. His promises fit a Europe searching for roots and rivals to outmaneuver. If Columbus had been less stubborn, less grandiose, less willing to force evidence into his design, perhaps he would never have crossed the Atlantic. But those same traits make the consequences of his voyage devastating. By the time the Spanish crown finally accepts his proposal, the man and the moment have found each other. The agreement signed at Santa Fe gives Columbus extraordinary rewards if he succeeds. And in that document, the future is already being imagined as property. Lands not yet seen are treated as governable. Peoples not yet encountered are silently placed within a framework of rule. Wealth not yet found is divided in advance. What survives in the record suggests a chilling confidence. The unknown is not approached as a realm of equal human worlds, but as a space where European claims can take root the instant a flag touches sand. Columbus leaves Spain carrying this framework inside him. He is not just sailing toward a horizon. He is sailing toward confirmation. Every bird, every cloud, every floating branch becomes part of the story he believes he is destined to complete.
The tragedy is that the ocean will give him land before it proves him wrong. It will allow his error to look like success. It will let obsession wear the face of destiny. And when a man like that reaches a world he cannot understand, the first act is not discovery. It is interpretation. The second is possession. The third, already waiting in the shadows, is violence. The ships move westward under canvas that has begun to feel like fate. Day after day, the trade winds push them onward with unnerving steadiness, filling the sails as if the ocean itself wants the voyage to continue. To Columbus, those winds are a gift. To the men around him, they may also feel like a trap. A wind that carries a ship away from home is only comforting if one believes it can be reversed.
Out here, beyond the last familiar islands, the air seems to have made its choice, and the choice is west. The fleet is small enough to seem almost fragile against the Atlantic. The Santa Maria, the largest vessel, is not a great ship by later imperial standards, but a broad, stubborn carrier, better suited to cargo than speed. The Nina and the Pinta are smaller caravels, more agile, more responsive, and in some ways better adapted to exploration. Together they form not a conquering armada, but a risky experiment made of wood, rope, iron, pitch, and human nerves. A wind that carries a ship away from home is only comforting if one believes it can be reversed. Out here, beyond the last familiar islands, the air seems to have made its choice, and the choice is west. The fleet is small enough to seem almost fragile against the Atlantic. The Santa Maria, the largest vessel, is not a great ship by later imperial standards, but a broad, stubborn carrier, better suited to cargo than speed. The Nina and the Pinta are smaller caravels, more agile, more responsive, and in some ways, better adapted to exploration. Together they form not a conquering armada, but a risky experiment made of wood, rope, iron, pitch, and human nerves. Their holds carry food, water, tools, trade goods, weapons, religious objects, and the paperwork of royal authority.
They also carry assumptions so heavy that no ship's carpenter could measure them. Life aboard is cramped and physical. Men sleep where they can, eat what survives the damp, and work according to the demands of wind and sail. Bread hardens, water stales. Salt meat becomes less a meal than an endurance test. Vermin are not an exception but part of the environment. Privacy barely exists. The smell of tar, sweat, bilge water,
smoke, and aging provisions becomes the air they breathe. Modern retellings often reduce the crossing to a few dramatic moments of fear. But the greater strain may have been repetition. The same horizon, the same creaking hull, the same uneasy arithmetic of distance. Columbus watches the sea constantly. He looks for weeds, birds, clouds, fish, shifts in watercolor, anything that might become a sign. He is a sailor of experience, and this matters. The Atlantic is not pure mystery to him. He knows island routes. He knows that winds and currents can be used like invisible roads. He understands the importance of the Canary Islands as a launching point, because from there, the easterly trade, winds can carry ships west, across the subtropical Atlantic. Yet knowledge and guesswork are braided together. The fact that the winds are real does not make his destination what he thinks it is. The crew's fear grows in the space between practical seamanship and false geography. They are not cowards. Many are hardened mariners, but courage is not the absence of calculation. A sailor who respects the sea also respects limits, and the limit now seems to be dissolving behind them. They sail farther than ordinary experience prepares them for. Each day westward increases the distance that must somehow be crossed again in reverse. The evidence remains incomplete about the exact mood aboard the ships at every stage, because the main surviving narrative is shaped by Columbus's own record and later transcription. But tension clearly builds. There are complaints, anxieties, perhaps threats, and certainly negotiations of authority. One lesser-known detail reveals the psychological delicacy of the voyage. Columbus appears to keep two records of distance, one that may reflect his fuller estimate, and another smaller figure reported to the crew. Historians debate the precise interpretation of this practice, but the implication is powerful. Distance is not only a measurement, it is a form of morale. Tell men they are too far from home, and the voyage may collapse before the ocean yields land. Tell them less, and command survives another day. On a small ship in an unknown sea, arithmetic becomes politics. There are also strange events that unsettle the men, because they do not fit familiar expectations. At one point, the compass needle no longer points exactly as expected. Columbus observes magnetic variation, the difference between magnetic north and true north. Though he does not understand it in modern terms, this is not a supernatural omen, but to men already sailing beyond known limits, it can feel like the world's hidden machinery is shifting. Even the instruments seem less trustworthy. The sky remains beautiful, but beauty is not reassurance when the rules beneath it appear to bend. The Sargasso Sea adds another layer of unease. The ships enter waters where floating seaweed gathers in great mats, moved by currents within the North Atlantic gyre. To modern science, this is an ecological region of remarkable significance, a drifting habitat for fish, eels, turtles, and countless small creatures. To Columbus's crew, it may suggest shoals, trapped water, or land nearby that never quite appears. Weeds brush the hulls. The ocean looks altered, almost meadow-like in places, yet still refuses to become shore. A lesser imagination might see this as promise. A frightened sailor might see it as warning. Columbus uses every sign to sustain the voyage. Birds become especially important. Land birds cannot remain forever at sea, or so the reasoning goes, and flocks moving in certain directions suggest islands. Reeds, carved wood, branches, and other floating objects are treated as messages from an unseen coast. Some signs are real, some are ambiguous, some may be interpreted through desperation. No single explanation fully accounts for how the men weighed them. But each object drifting past the ships must have carried an emotional charge far greater than its size. A stick in the water can be almost nothing. After weeks at sea, it can feel like evidence that the world has not ended. Still, full certainty haunts the commander. Columbus believes he is approaching islands near Asia, and so he interprets the Atlantic accordingly. When signs appear, they do not simply indicate land. In his mind, They confirm the structure of the world he has promised to Spain. He is not searching neutrally. He is looking for proof that his calculations, his readings, his demands, and his destiny are correct. That hunger for confirmation may be one of the voyage's most dangerous forces. The ocean is giving him clues, but he is already deciding what they mean. The men around him have a more immediate concern: survival. Their fear is sharpened by the possibility that land may not appear soon enough.
Food and water can be rationed, but confidence cannot be stored in barrels. Authority aboard a ship depends on command, skill, discipline, and belief. If belief breaks, even a royal contract cannot hold a crew together. Later, stories of near mutiny have been embellished in some tellings, and scholars still debate how dramatic the confrontation truly became. But there is little doubt that Columbus faces pressure to turn back. The question is not whether the sailors are frightened. The question is how close fear comes to overwhelming obedience. The answer lies somewhere in those tense October days, when signs of land become harder to Columbus dismiss. Birds pass overhead in greater numbers. The water carries more vegetation. The air itself may seem changed, though memory can easily color such impressions afterward. The ships alter course, following what Columbus and others believe are indications of nearby land. In the darkness, men listen differently. The same creak of rigging, the same slap of water, the same wind across canvas, now seems to belong to an approaching threshold. There is a strange intimacy in the final hours before landfall. The vast imperial consequences are still invisible. There are no armies yet, no plantations, no mines, no collapsing populations counted by later historians. There are only tired men aboard wooden vessels, staring into the night for a line of shore. Yet history often hides its largest turns inside such narrow human scenes. A lookout's cry, a pale strip of sand, a shadow against stars, the breaking of surf. These are small sensory details, but they open into centuries. Columbus has promised rewards to the first man who sights land, though disputes will later surround who truly deserves credit and whether promises are honored. This too is revealing. Even before the land is understood, it is being placed inside a system of reward, claim, and hierarchy. The first sight is not only wonder, it is entitlement. Someone will be paid, someone will be named, someone will claim authority over what appears. What survives in the record suggests that land is sighted in the early hours of October 12, 1492, after more than a month beyond the Canaries.
The island is part of the Bahamian world, though the exact location remains debated among historians and geographers. That uncertainty matters. Even one of the most famous landfalls in world history cannot be pinned down with absolute confidence. The event has been polished into legend, but the map beneath the legend still has blurred edges. For the sailors, the uncertainty is over. There is land. The voyage has not vanished into the Atlantic. Their commander's promise has not ended in starvation. Relief must have moved through the ships like warmth after fever. But relief is not truth. Columbus does not know where he is. He does not understand the human world ahead. He does not know that his success depends on a geographic accident larger than his imagination.
The ships approach in the half-light, and the island waits with its beaches, trees, waters, paths, gardens, homes, and people. It is not a prize rising from emptiness. It is a lived place. The sea has not delivered Columbus to Asia, but to a doorway into histories older than his, kingdom's ambitions. He will step ashore with flags and formal words, carrying royal power onto sand that has no need of Spain to be real. In that moment, fear aboard the ships gives way to false certainty. The men have survived the crossing, so the voyage will soon be called successful. Columbus has found land, so his errors will be treated as vision. Europe has reached the Caribbean, so the story will be named Discovery. But beneath those names, something more troubling is unfolding. The ocean has not confirmed Columbus's world. It has exposed the danger of a man who cannot tell the difference between arrival and understanding.
Morning comes over the island with the softness of a world that has no idea it is about to be renamed. The daylight gathers slowly on the water, turning the shallows clear enough to reveal sand beneath the waves. Trees stand thick beyond the beach. Birds move through the heat. The air is warm, green, and full of life. After weeks of Atlantic emptiness, the island must have seemed almost impossible to the sailors. Not merely land, but relief made visible. Yet for the people who already live there, the arrival of the ships is not the end of a voyage. It is the beginning of an intrusion. Columbus steps into this landscape, believing he has reached the Indies, the outer island world of Asia. This is the first great misreading on land, and it shapes almost everything that follows. The people he meets become, in European language, Indians, not because of who they are, but because of where Columbus wrongly thinks he is. A mistaken geography becomes a human label. The error will outlive him by centuries. The island has its own name, though Columbus gives it another. He calls it San Salvador, placing a Christian claim over an indigenous reality. The exact island of first landfall remains debated, with several Bahamian candidates proposed by historians and navigators, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the symbolic pattern is clear enough. The first European act is not careful listening. It is naming. The second is claiming. The third is interpreting the people through the needs of empire. What survives in the record suggests that the first encounters are marked by curiosity, caution, and exchange. The islanders come near. They see men unlike any they have seen before, ships unlike any craft in their waters, metal objects, cloth, weapons, and gestures that must be read without shared language. Columbus sees bodies, ornaments, scars, canoes, and faces. But he does not truly see a society. He sees possibilities. He notices that some people wear small pieces of gold. He notices that they do not carry European-style weapons. He notices that they are willing to trade. He notices their vulnerability, that attention is chilling. Even in his earliest descriptions, admiration and calculation sit side by side. He can describe people as gentle, generous, and physically impressive, then almost in the same breath, suggest they would make good servants. This is one of the darkest details of the first contact. The violence is not a later corruption of an initially pure moment. The logic of domination appears almost immediately. Columbus does not need years to begin imagining indigenous people as labor, subjects, converts, and captives. The framework is already with him when he steps ashore. The islanders, likely Lucayan Taino, belong to a wider Caribbean world connected by travel, trade, kinship, conflict, and shared cultural patterns. They are skilled navigators in their own waters. Their canoes can be large and seaworthy. Their communities cultivate crops, especially cassava, a plant that requires sophisticated processing to remove toxins and transform it into durable food. They fish, gather, make pottery, shape wood, weave cotton, and live within landscapes managed through generations of experience. To describe them only at the moment of European arrival is already to distort them, because it traps them inside the first European gaze. Columbus does not have the patience, language, or perhaps the desire to understand this world on its own terms. He is searching for signs of Asia. He asks, gestures, infers, and misunderstands. Where is gold? Where are the great cities? Where is the ruler? Where are the spices? The island becomes not a place but a clue that seems to point elsewhere. This is another quiet tragedy of the first landing. Even when Columbus is physically present, his mind is always partly somewhere else, chasing the Asia he expects to find. The people he meets are pulled into this misreading. Their ornaments become evidence of nearby wealth. Their gestures become directions. Their bodies become proof that they can be ruled. Their hospitality becomes, in European eyes, weakness. Scholars still debate many details of these first exchanges, because the surviving descriptions come overwhelmingly through European pens, especially Columbus's own words,
as preserved and edited in later forms. Indigenous interpretations of the moment are mostly lost, but the imbalance of the record itself tells part of the story.
The first contact is remembered largely by those who came to claim, not by those who watched them arrive. There is no need to imagine the islanders as naive or passive. They may have approached with diplomatic curiosity. They may have sought to understand whether these strangers were dangerous, useful, sacred, or merely bizarre. Caribbean peoples had long experience with visitors from other islands. They knew trade, alliance, and conflict. But nothing in their world had prepared them for the specific machinery behind these ships. The legal doctrines of a European monarchy, the hunger for precious metals, the epidemic vulnerabilities of intercontinental contact, and the willingness to turn people into forced labor under a distant crown. The first gifts exchanged carry two meanings at once. To the islanders, exchange may establish relationship. To Columbus, it helps confirm access. Glass beads, red caps, small bells, and other European items pass into indigenous hands. In return, Columbus gathers information, ornaments, and signs. The scene can be described as peaceful, but peaceful does not mean equal. Beneath the surface lies a severe asymmetry of intention. One side is trying to understand strangers within a living world. The other is already placing that world into a structure of possession. Columbus performs a formal act of claim for the Spanish monarchs. The ritual would have made sense within European legal imagination, but on the island itself, it is almost absurd. He declares authority over land already inhabited by people who have not consented, who do not share his language, who do not recognize Ferdinand and Isabella, and who cannot possibly understand the political meaning attached to the flags, words, and gestures. Yet empires often begin with such absurdities. A ceremony meaningful to the invader becomes, in later documents, the foundation of ownership. This is the dark power of writing. A few lines in a European record can transform a beach into a possession. A name entered into a log can overwrite older names in imperial memory. A description of people as simple, generous, or lacking weapons can become evidence for conquest. The island does not change in that instant. The trees remain trees. The sea keeps moving over the reef.
The people remain themselves. But in the archive of Europe, the place has already been pulled into another world. Columbus continues from island to island, still convinced he is near Asia. He hears, or thinks he hears, about lands with more gold. He searches for Chipangu, the name Europeans associate with Japan, and for the mainland realms described in travel literature. Every new island becomes another misread sign. The Caribbean is vast, intricate, and culturally alive. But Columbus treats it as the outer edge of something else. He is like a man holding the wrong key and forcing every door to match it. The misreading matters because it determines behavior.
Had Columbus understood immediately that he had reached an entire hemisphere unknown to Europeans, the consequences might still have been violent. The forces behind the voyage were already imperial, but his insistence that these lands belong to the Indies allows him to frame the people and places within expectations formed before arrival. He is not discovering reality. He is editing reality into the shape of a promise. Gold soon becomes the obsession that sharpens every misunderstanding. Small ornaments become hints of mines. Hints become expectations. Expectations become demands. The people who first meet Columbus are drawn into a search whose logic they did not create. The absence of vast treasure does not weaken European hunger. It intensifies it, sending ships farther, questions deeper, and coercion closer. There is a haunting imbalance between what Columbus thinks has happened and what has truly begun. In his mind, he has opened a western route to Asia and secured glory for Spain. In the Caribbean, he has introduced a new and dangerous presence into an existing world. The first landing is often painted as a scene of wonder. Flags, kneeling men, bright sand, astonished islanders. But beneath the painted surface is a harder image. A man stands on a beach, wrong about where he is, wrong about whom he has met, and already certain
that both land and people can be claimed. The tragedy of San Salvador, or whatever island first received the ships, is not only that Columbus misunderstands it. It is that his misunderstanding has power. An ordinary mistake might fade. This one is backed by monarchy, ships, weapons, contracts, and the expanding ambition of Europe. The island enters European history under a name Columbus gives it, while its own deeper histories are pushed towards silence. As the ships move on through the Caribbean, the first misreading travels with them. The land is Asia until proven otherwise, and even then, Columbus will resist the truth. The people are potential Christians, potential servants, potential sources of information, potential obstacles, but rarely sovereign human communities in their own right. The sea that once seemed empty now reveals island after island, and each new shore becomes another place where wonder is shadowed by possession. The first landfall, then, is not a clean beginning. It is a wound disguised as a rival. It is the moment when two worlds meet under unequal terms, when one side's error becomes another side's catastrophe, and when a beach in the Bahamas becomes the threshold of an age that will call itself discovery while practicing conquest. Beyond the first beach, beyond the flags and the astonished faces recorded through European eyes, there is an island world far older and more intricate than Columbus understands. The Caribbean is not a scattered emptiness waiting to be entered by history. It is a sea of movement, memory, cultivation, exchange, and power. Its islands rise from blue water like separate worlds, but they are not isolated in the way Europeans imagine. Canoes move between them. Stories travel, goods travel, marriages, rivalries, rituals, and warnings travel. The sea is not a wall for the people who know it. The sea is a road. The Taino, whose communities stretch across much of the Greater Antilles and parts of the Bahamas, live in landscapes shaped by both nature and human hands. Their villages are built near rivers, coasts, gardens, and fishing grounds. Some settlements are small and intimate. Others are large, organized centers of authority. Houses are made from wood, palm thatch, and other materials drawn from the environment with practiced skill. The round houses of many common families, and the larger rectangular houses associated with chiefs, are not primitive shelters, but forms suited to climate, social life, and local resources. They breathe with the heat. They resist the storms, as well as any human structure can in a hurricane world. At the center of many communities stands the authority of the cacique, a leader whose power is political, ceremonial, and economic. Leadership does not look like European kingship, and that difference leads Europeans to underestimate or misread it. A cacique's influence may depend on lineage, redistribution, ritual status, alliances, and the ability to organize labor and exchange. Communities cultivate cassava, maize, sweet potatoes, peppers, beans, cotton, and other crops. Cassava is especially important because it demands knowledge hidden beneath its plain appearance. Bitter varieties can be poisonous if processed incorrectly. Yet Caribbean peoples transform them into bread and food stores through grating, pressing, drying, and baking. A society that can turn poison into sustenance is not simple. It is deeply experienced. The islanders also shape their spiritual world through objects known as zemis, sacred beings, or ancestral powers, often represented in carved stone, wood, bone, shell, or cotton. To European observers, these objects may appear as idols, a word that immediately places them inside Christian judgment. But for the people who make and honor them, they belong to a living relationship between humans, ancestors, land, fertility, weather, and authority. Scholars still debate many details of Taino religion because the surviving descriptions are filtered through outsiders, missionaries, and colonial administrators. But what survives in the record suggests a world where politics, farming, healing, and spiritual power are tightly connected. There are ceremonial plazas and ball courts in parts of the Taino world,
places where gatherings, games, rituals, and displays of power unfold. The ball game, known in different forms across the Caribbean and broader indigenous Americas, is not merely sport in the modern sense. It can carry social, ceremonial, and political meaning. Stone-lined plazas, carved figures, and carefully organized spaces reveal communities with shared symbols and public life. None of this fits the later myth of people without history. The evidence remains incomplete, but the fragments that survive are enough to overturn the emptiness imposed by colonial imagination. The Taino are not the only people of the Caribbean, and even the word Taino can flatten diversity. The islands hold many communities, languages, and identities, some related, some distinct, some in conflict, some linked by trade or kinship. Europeans will later speak fearfully of Caribs, often using the term in ways that mix real rivalries, misunderstanding, and political convenience. Accusations of cannibalism become especially dangerous because they provide moral permission for enslavement and violence. Some indigenous groups may indeed have practiced forms of ritual violence or warfare that shocked Europeans, but colonial labels turned complex human conflicts into categories of savagery. No single explanation fully accounts for these reports, and many were shaped by the interests of those who wanted captives, labor, and justification. For Columbus, this complexity is mostly invisible. He searches for hierarchy he can use, gold he can seize, and signs that match his expectation of Asia. He notes canoes with admiration, sometimes describing them as swift and well-made. He observes cotton, ornaments, and cultivated fields. He sees that people travel by water with ease, yet he repeatedly converts observation into utility. Canoes become evidence of mobility that might serve European purposes. Cotton becomes commodity. Gold ornaments become clues to mines. Human generosity becomes a sign that the people can be ruled. The Taino response to the strangers is not preserved in their own written accounts, and this silence is one of the great injuries of the archive. Still, traces can be inferred carefully. Communities likely assess the newcomers through existing diplomatic habits. Strangers arriving by sea are not unimaginable in the Caribbean. Trade and raiding already exist. Gift exchange can establish obligations. Hospitality can test intention. Curiosity does not mean surrender. Kindness does not mean ignorance. What Columbus interprets as innocence may be something else entirely. Controlled welcome, political caution, or an attempt to draw unknown visitors into known patterns of relationship. But the Europeans do not enter those patterns honestly. They carry a different system, one in which land can be claimed for distant monarchs, people can be categorized as subjects without consent, and spiritual conversion can be fused with labor control. The mismatch is catastrophic, because neither side holds equal power to define what the encounter means. The Taino may greet, trade, guide, and observe. Columbus writes. Spain receives the writing. The archive hardens around his interpretation. The island world also has vulnerabilities no one can see. Its people have never been exposed to the full range of old-world diseases that Europeans carry within their bodies and their animals. This does not make collapse immediate on the first day, nor does disease alone explain the violence that follows, but it creates a deadly biological imbalance. The Caribbean has its own illnesses, its own healing knowledge, its own hardships, but it has not lived through the long disease exchanges of Europe, Asia, and Africa. When sustained contact expands, invisible pathogens will move faster than armies. They will travel along the same routes as trade, flight, coercion, and settlement. They will reach people who have never seen the ships. For now, though, the first encounters remain suspended between wonder and danger. Europeans marvel at the beauty of the islands, the clarity of the water, the abundance of trees, the brightness of birds, the grace of canoes, and the apparent openness of the people. That admiration is real, but it is unstable. It can turn quickly into frustration when the land does not produce the expected gold. Turn into contempt
When indigenous people refuse European demands, it can turn into violence. When the fantasy of easy wealth meets the reality of societies that do not exist for Spain. A lesser-known truth about the Caribbean before conquest is that it is already a world of change. Peoples have migrated through it over thousands of years, moving from mainland South America and elsewhere into island chains, adapting to different environments, developing local cultures, and maintaining ties across water. Archaeology reveals layers of settlement, pottery traditions, foodways, trade objects, and burial practices. The islands are not frozen in a timeless Eden. They have histories of arrival, transformation, conflict, and creativity. Columbus does not discover motion, he interrupts it. This matters because one of the oldest colonial tricks is to portray indigenous societies as part of nature rather than history. Forest, river, island, and people are blended into a scenic background. Beautiful, but supposedly undeveloped, ready to be improved by outsiders. Yet the Taino and their neighbors are not background. They are historical actors. They make decisions. They negotiate. They resist. They suffer. They survive. In fragments, descendants, memory, language, food, and place names, despite centuries of attempts to declare them vanished. The first Europeans do not understand that survival will become one of the great hidden themes of the story. Later colonial accounts often speak as if indigenous Caribbean peoples disappear, completely, wiped away by disease and conquest. The losses are indeed catastrophic, almost beyond comprehension. But disappearance is not the same as extinction. Communities are shattered, absorbed, displaced, and transformed. Yet indigenous ancestry and cultural traces persist across the Caribbean. Scholars still debate the scale and continuity of different survivals, but the old colonial claim of total erasure is itself part of the violence. It makes conquest seem complete. It turns living descendants into ghosts. In 1492, none of this future is visible on the surface of the water. Columbus sees islands and asks where the gold is. The people of the islands see ships and try to understand what kind of strangers have arrived. Between those two acts of seeing lies the central tragedy. One side encounters a living world, the other sees a map waiting to be filled. As the Europeans move from shore to shore, the Caribbean begins to change in the European imagination. It becomes a zone of promise and frustration, beauty and greed, soft beaches and hard demands. The islanders become guides, translators, captives, symbols, and obstacles. Their humanity is never entirely invisible to Columbus, and that makes the story even darker. He can see enough to admire them. He can see enough to know they feel fear, curiosity, pain, and trust. Yet he still folds them into a plan that treats them as means. The dark truth is not that Columbus fails to notice the people of the island world. It is that he notices them and immediately begins measuring how they might be used. Gold enters the story almost quietly at first, not as a mountain of treasure or a glittering city, but as small ornaments against human skin. A little piece worn in the nose, a faint yellow flash at the ear, a hint carried in gesture, rumor, and misunderstanding from one island to another. After the long Atlantic crossing, after the shock of landfall, after the first exchanges of beads, bells, cotton, parrots, and food, Columbus begins to circle back, again and again, to the same question: where does the gold come from? It is a question with the weight of Europe behind it. Gold is not simply beauty. In the 15th century Atlantic world, gold is credit, monarchy, war, faith, status, and proof. A voyage may be praised as holy, bold, and heroic, but royal support expects return. Columbus has promised wealth. He has promised access to the riches of Asia. He has promised that the Western Sea can become a road not merely to lands but to profit. The small pieces of gold he sees among Caribbean islanders become more than ornaments. They become evidence he desperately needs. The tragedy is that the evidence is thin and his desire is not.
The Caribbean does contain gold in some places, especially on larger islands such as Hispaniola, but not in the vast and easy quantities Columbus imagines. The islanders he meets do not organize their lives around gold in the way Europeans do.
Gold may have decorative, exchange, or symbolic value, but it is not the center of political economy in the European sense. To Columbus, this difference is nearly impossible to accept. If there is some gold, there must be more. If a person wears a small ornament, there must be a source nearby. If the source is not here, then it must be on the next island, or the next coast, or just beyond the next misunderstanding. So the voyage becomes a chase through clues. Every gesture is interpreted as direction. Every indigenous explanation passes through broken communication and European paired expectation. Place names become distorted. Rumors harden into promises. The word for one region or people may be mistaken for a kingdom rich in treasure. A hint of metal becomes the shadow of a mine. Scholars still debate many details of these early conversations because they were filtered through no shared language and then written by men whose hopes were already attached to the answers. What survives in the record suggests not careful translation, but a dangerous chain of inference. At first, the search can still look almost diplomatic. Columbus gives small objects, asks questions, receives food and assistance, and moves between islands with guides, taken or persuaded from local communities. The tone of the encounter may appear peaceful, but beneath it is a growing imbalance. The Europeans are not simply guests. They are gathering intelligence. They are learning routes, harbors, currents, political divisions, and sources of supply. They are identifying who can be pressured, who can be used, and where wealth might be extracted. Curiosity is becoming reconnaissance. Gold fever is not always loud. Sometimes it begins as notation, a sentence in a log, a repeated observation, a promise to the crown that richer lands lie ahead. Columbus must write a version of events that justifies the voyage. His descriptions are shaped by the need to turn uncertainty into confidence. If he cannot yet display the riches of Asia, he can describe their signs. If he cannot fill ships with gold, he can fill royal imagination with expectation. This is one of the lesser-known engines of empire. Before conquest is fully practical, it must be made believable to people far away. The islanders feel the shift, even if they cannot know its full meaning. The strangers ask insistently about one material. They are pleased by it in ways that seem disproportionate. They take people along to guide them. They examine ornaments. They speak of rulers, islands, and sources of metal with increasing urgency. What may begin as exchange starts to narrow into demand. No single explanation fully accounts for every indigenous response, but it is easy to imagine caution spreading. These newcomers are not satisfied by hospitality. They want something the land may not provide in the form they expect. Columbus's attention gradually fixes on Hispaniola, the large island known to its inhabitants through their own names and political landscapes. To European eyes, it seems promising. Larger, greener, richer in rivers and mountains, with signs that gold may be found in the interior. Here, the fantasy of wealth gains a more durable foothold. Columbus begins to imagine not just contact, but settlement, not just trade, but extraction. A temporary voyage starts to become a colonial project. This transformation is crucial. A ship can visit and leave. A colony stays. A colony needs labor, food, authority, punishment, and a story that explains why outsiders have the right to command. Gold gives urgency to all of this. If gold exists inland, someone must collect it. If local people know the terrain, they must guide. If they resist, they must be subdued. If they do not understand European ownership, they must be taught through force. The logic does not unfold all at once, but its outline is already visible. Columbus's own language helps reveal the change. He does not only speak of wonder, he speaks of taking possession, of service, of conversion, of resources, of what the people lack in weapons, and of how easily they might be made to obey.
The gentleness, he observes, becomes not a reason for respect, but an argument for domination. This is one of the voyage's deepest moral failures. Vulnerability is read as opportunity. Trust is read as weakness. Difference is read as inferiority. The people who offer food and knowledge are being measured for control. There is a grim continuity here, with earlier Atlantic expansion on islands already touched by Portuguese and Spanish colonization.
Europeans have learned to connect land, labor, and profit. Sugar plantations in the Atlantic world are beginning to show how brutal that connection can become. Enslaved Africans, conquered islanders, and coerced workers are pulled into systems that transform ecology and human life together. The Caribbean after Columbus will become one of the central theaters of this plantation world. Though that future is not yet fully formed in 1492, still the habits are present. Gold is the first obsession, but it will not be the last. When one form of wealth disappoints, another will be demanded from land and bodies. The search for gold also distorts geography. Columbus moves through the Caribbean as if each place is valuable mainly for what it might lead to.
Islands become stepping stones toward richer islands. Peoples become informants about other peoples. A landscape of homes, gardens, cemeteries, and sacred places becomes a map of potential extraction. What survives in the record suggests that even beauty is often recorded as usefulness. Good harbors, fertile land, timber, water, cotton, and possible mines. The European eye inventories the world. This inventory has consequences. Once a place is described in terms of resources, it becomes easier to imagine taking them. Once people are described in terms of labor, it becomes easier to command them. Once gold is presented to the crown as near and obtainable, failure to obtain it becomes someone's fault. Soon, indigenous communities will be forced into impossible systems of tribute, ordered to deliver gold dust and other goods under threats of punishment. That later brutality grows from this early moment, when small ornaments are transformed into imperial expectation. The dark truth is that gold fever does not require gold in abundance. It requires belief. It requires men with ships, weapons, and royal backing to believe that wealth is hidden and that local people are withholding it. Such belief is dangerous because absence becomes evidence of concealment. If gold is not found, perhaps the guides lied. If tribute is low, perhaps workers are lazy. If communities flee, perhaps they are rebellious. The fantasy protects itself by blaming the victims of its disappointment. Columbus is not alone in this. The crown wants results. Investors want returns. Sailors want reward. Later settlers will want land and labor. The entire enterprise leans toward extraction, because extraction is the language in which success will be measured. A peaceful exchange of gifts cannot satisfy the structure that sent the ships west. The voyage must produce something that can be weighed, shipped, taxed, displayed, and used to justify more voyages. And so the Caribbean, first encountered as a place of astonishment, begins to darken in European hands. The islanders' ornaments no longer simply adorn the body. They become clues in a treasure hunt they never agreed to join. Their knowledge of rivers and mountains becomes a tool others want to seize. Their political divisions become openings. Their generosity becomes dangerous to themselves. Columbus still believes he is near Asia. He still imagines great rulers and richer lands somewhere close. But his search has already shifted the moral atmosphere. The first landfall was a misreading. The pursuit of gold turns that misreading into a system. It teaches the Europeans to look at people and see labor, to look at islands and see property, to look at uncertainty and see hidden wealth. The sea has delivered them not to the markets of Asia, but to a world they are preparing to break in. The name of riches they barely understand. The quiet beginning of gold fever is therefore more frightening than a sudden massacre, because it shows the machinery forming before it is fully unleashed. The ships still move under bright skies. Exchanges still occur. Smiles may still pass between strangers. But beneath the surface, a new question rules the encounter. And it is not a question that leads to understanding. It is the question of where the gold is. And once that question becomes supreme, almost everything living around it is in danger. The first captives are taken before the full machinery of conquest has a name. That is what makes the moment so revealing. There are no great colonial cities yet, no sugar estates spreading across the islands, no royal bureaucracy fully settled into the Caribbean, no mines organized on the later scale of empire. There are only ships moving through unfamiliar water, a commander searching for gold and proof, and indigenous people whose knowledge suddenly becomes valuable enough to steal. Columbus does not merely meet islanders and leave them behind. He takes some with him. In the European record, these seizures can be described almost casually, as if taking human beings from their homes is part of navigation. They are useful as guides. They may help with language. They may show where gold comes from. They may be presented in Spain as living evidence of the lands reached across the ocean. The language of usefulness softens the violence, but it does not change what is happening. People are being removed from their communities without meaningful consent, carried onto ships, and turned into instruments of another power's ambition. This is one of the dark truths often hidden beneath the smoother word encounter. An encounter suggests meeting. Captivity reveals control. Columbus's earliest actions show that he is prepared to treat indigenous bodies as movable property when it serves his purposes. The logic is not yet the vast transatlantic slave system that will later scar the Americas and in Africa on a massive scale. But it belongs to the same family of thought. Human beings can be classified, transported, displayed, converted, traded, and forced into service by those who claim superior authority. What survives in the record suggests that Columbus sees captives as practical solutions to immediate problems. He needs interpreters, but there is no shared language. He needs guides, but he does not fully understand local politics. He needs proof for the Spanish monarchs, and living captives make the voyage tangible in a way maps and ornaments cannot. A person taken from the Caribbean can stand in a European court as evidence that the admiral has reached inhabited lands. The captive becomes a symbol before anyone has properly understood his world. The human cost of this symbolic use is almost entirely absent from Columbus's own framing. Imagine, though, the rupture from the other side. A person drawn or forced onto a foreign vessel, surrounded by armed strangers, separated from family, island, language, food, ritual, and the familiar roots of the sea. The ship itself is a prison made of moving wood. It smells wrong. It obeys no known social order. It leaves the horizon behind for people whose world is connected by canoe travel. The sea is not unknown, but this kind of voyage is something else entirely. It is removal into a system they cannot read. Scholars still debate the exact circumstances of individual seizures, partly because the sources are incomplete and overwhelmingly European. Some indigenous people may have gone aboard voluntarily at first, curious or diplomatic, before realizing they could not freely leave. Others were clearly taken by force. The distinction matters, but it should not obscure the larger pattern. Once European commanders decide that indigenous people are resources, consent becomes fragile, ambiguous, and often meaningless. Power decides the interpretation. Columbus's treatment of captives also shows how quickly categories begin to form. Some islanders are imagined as gentle and suitable for conversion. Others, especially those labeled as hostile or associated with feared neighboring groups, are pushed toward a different category: enemies, cannibals, legitimate targets. These labels will later become tools of enslavement. To call one group peaceful and another savage is not just description, it is policy in embryo. It helps decide who may be protected, who may be exploited, and who may be hunted. The charge of cannibalism is especially dangerous. European accounts of the Caribbean speak of peoples who raid, fight, and consume human flesh. But these reports are entangled with fear, rumor, misunderstanding, and political advantage. Some ritual practices may have existed among some groups, and indigenous warfare was real, but European use of the label cannibal quickly becomes broader than evidence can safely support. No single explanation fully accounts for the reports, and modern scholars remain cautious. What is clear is how useful the accusation becomes. If people are classified as cannibals, then violence against them can be framed as rescue, punishment, or righteous domination. Captivity and classification grow together. A person taken aboard may be asked through signs and broken words about other islands. A frightened gesture may be turned into a claim. A claim may become a route. A route may become a raid. The first captives are not only victims, they are also forced into the production of European knowledge. Their bodies and words are used to build the map that will bring more ships. This is one of the lesser-known violences of exploration. Information is extracted before land is fully occupied. Europeans do not need to understand a society deeply to damage it. They only need enough knowledge to move through it, enough names to locate targets, enough divisions to exploit, enough geography to return. Captives become unwilling bridges between worlds, carrying fragments of language and place into the hands of men who intend to command. The first seizures also reveal the weakness of Columbus's supposed diplomacy. Gift exchange continues, but gift exchange, under the shadow of abduction, is no longer simple. A community that sees relatives or neighbors taken must reassess the strangers. Are they guests, traders, enemies, spirits, raiders, or something without precedent? The evidence remains incomplete, but it is hard to imagine that trust remains untouched. Fear begins to move ahead of the ships. Stories travel faster than sails in an island world. A canoe can carry warning long before a European document records hostility. To Columbus, resistance can easily confirm the need for control. This pattern will recur throughout colonial history. If indigenous people welcome Europeans, they are judged easy to rule. If they resist, they are judged dangerous and in need of punishment. Either response can be turned into justification. The colonizer's logic is sealed against contradiction. Hospitality proves submission. Resistance proves savagery. In such a system, indigenous freedom has almost no place to stand. The captives carried by Columbus are also part of a broader medieval and Atlantic habit of displaying people from distant lands. Courts want marvels. Monarchs want evidence. Chroniclers want stories. A living person can be made to serve as proof of geography, proof of mission, proof of royal reach. This is not unique to Spain, and it is not invented in 1492, but the Caribbean gives it new force. The bodies of indigenous people become part of Europe's first attempt to understand, possess, and advertise the Western lands. The moral darkness deepens because Columbus often speaks of conversion while practicing coercion. To bring people to Christianity in his mind may be part of a divine mission, yet the first act towards some of them is forced removal. The contradiction is glaring, but within the imperial mindset, it can be made to disappear. If European Christians believe they possess the true faith, then coercion can be recast as salvation. If captives are imagined as future converts, their suffering can be minimized as temporary or necessary. This logic will become one of the most destructive features of conquest. Violence presented as care. Not every Spaniard sees all of this in exactly the same way, and later debates within Spain will question the treatment of indigenous peoples with real intensity. But those debates come after violence has already begun. In the first voyage, there is little institutional restraint. Columbus is operating at the edge of known royal oversight, where distance gives command a dangerous freedom. The sea that separates him from Spain also shields his choices from immediate judgment. As the ships continue, captives remain aboard as reminders of a new order forming. They are no longer simply members of their own communities in the eyes of the Europeans. They are interpreters in training, guides, trophies, diplomatic tools, possible servants, and evidence. Their individual names, fears, and memories are largely lost. The archive preserves their usefulness more readily than their humanity. That silence is not accidental. Empires are very good at recording what they take, and very poor at recording what taking feels like. Yet even through the silence, the meaning is clear. The first captives mark the point at which Columbus's A Voyage crosses from misrecognition into direct violation. Naming land is an act of imperial imagination. Taking people is an act of bodily power. It announces that the Europeans are willing to make the Caribbean world move according to their demands. From this point forward, the encounter cannot be described as innocent. The ships that arrived as strangers have become vessels of removal. The search for gold has begun to require human instruments. The dream of Asia has turned Caribbean islanders into forced evidence for a geography that Columbus still misunderstands. And somewhere behind the ships, on beaches and in villages now missing people, the first grief of the new age begins. It is not yet counted in royal accounts. It is not yet measured by later historians. It is smaller, more immediate, and more intimate. An empty place in a family, a voice gone from a house, a canoe that returns without the person expected in it. Before empire becomes a system, it becomes absence. Once Columbus begins to write the islands into Europe's possession, the Caribbean changes inside the imperial imagination, faster than it changes on the ground. The beaches remain beaches. The forests still breathe in the heat. The gardens still produce cassava, maize, peppers, and cotton. Canoes still move across bright water between islands whose roots and meanings long predate the Spanish ships. But in the records carried back across the Atlantic, these living places begin to harden into claims. A paradise becomes property, not because the land itself agrees, but because Europe has a language for taking that can make conquest sound orderly. This is one of the most dangerous powers of empire. It does not only conquer with weapons, it conquers with words. A place is named, a cross is raised, a flag is displayed. A formula of possession is spoken before people who do not share the legal world that gives the formula meaning. Then the act is written down as if authority has passed cleanly from the land into the hands of distant monarchs. What survives in the record suggests that Columbus understands these rituals as serious and binding. To the islanders, they may have seemed strange, theatrical, perhaps meaningless, perhaps threatening, but European law will later treat them as beginnings. The beauty of the islands helps disguise the violence of this transformation. Columbus repeatedly describes fertile land, clear rivers, good harbors, tall trees, mild air, and people who seem to him open and generous. Such descriptions have often been read as wonder, and wonder is truly present. The Caribbean dazzles the newcomers. After the harsh uncertainty of the Atlantic, the islands seem lush beyond expectation, yet admiration is quickly joined to inventory. Good harbors mean fleets can anchor, tall trees mean timber, fertile land means crops, rivers mean settlement, people mean labor and conversion. Beauty becomes a list of uses. A lesser-known darkness lies in this shift from landscape to asset. When Europeans call a place paradise, they do not necessarily mean it should be left intact. Often they mean it is worth possessing. Paradise becomes a promise of abundance available to the taker. The word softens greed by covering it in awe. It makes extraction feel like fulfillment, as if the land has been waiting to be properly used. No single explanation fully accounts for every phrase in Columbus's descriptions, but the pattern is unmistakable. The islands are praised in the same breath that they are offered to Spain as sources of wealth. Maps deepen the change. In Europe, maps are not neutral drawings. They are arguments about knowledge, power, and destiny. Coastlines traced by newcomers can make older indigenous geographies disappear. A European name written beside a bay can push aside names spoken for generations. Empty spaces on parchment do not prove empty lands. They prove only the limits of the mapmaker. Yet those blank or newly labeled spaces invite claims. They tell kings, merchants, and future settlers that the unknown has become available. The Caribbean already has its own mental maps, carried in memory, voyage, song, kinship, and practice. Island peoples know currents, reefs, winds, safe passages, dangerous coasts, neighboring communities, fishing grounds and sacred sites. Their geography is lived rather than printed. It does not need parchment to be real. But European power favors the written map, the charter, the royal grant, the notarized claim. When these systems meet, the written often dominates the remembered in the archive, even when the remembered is older and more accurate. Columbus's acts of naming are therefore not small details. They are part of possession.
San Salvador, Juana, Hispaniola. Names tied to Christian devotion, royal honor, and Spanish authority begin to cover indigenous places. Some original names survive, altered or fragmentary, while others are lost or uncertain. Scholars still debate the exact meanings and locations of some early names because the record is damaged, filtered, and confused. But the larger process is clear. Naming becomes a way to make the unfamiliar obedient to European categories. This obedience is imaginary at first. A name does not make a people surrender. A flag does not plant crops. A royal claim does not clear a forest, build a fort, mine a river, or force tribute by itself. But imaginary possession prepares real violence. It lets Europeans return believing they already own what they have barely seen.
It turns later resistance into rebellion rather than defense. If Spain has claimed the land, then indigenous refusal can be framed as disobedience. The trick is subtle and brutal. Declare authority first, then punish those who never accepted it. The people of the islands are also rewritten. Columbus often describes them through absence. They lack iron, lack European weapons, lack clothing by European standards, lack the religion he recognizes, lack the political forms he expects. This language of lack is one of conquest's oldest tools. It measures a society not by what it has built, but by what the invader wants and does not see. It ignores the knowledge required to survive hurricanes, cultivate cassava, navigate reefs, organize exchange, and maintain spiritual life across islands.
By defining people through what they supposedly lack, Europeans create a moral space in which domination can be described as improvement. At the same time, Columbus praises their intelligence, beauty, and generosity. The contradiction is not accidental. Colonial writing often admires indigenous people while denying them sovereignty. Admiration can make conquest seem benevolent. If the people are gentle, they can be converted. If they are generous, they can be guided. If they are unarmed, they can be ruled. The praise does not protect them. In some ways, it makes them more vulnerable, because it becomes evidence that control will be easy. The conversion of paradise into property also depends on distance. The Spanish monarchs do not see the islands directly. They receive reports, objects, captives, and promises. Their Caribbean is built from Columbus's words. This gives him enormous power to frame reality. He must show that the voyage deserves continued support, so the islands become fertile, rich, numerous, and strategically valuable. Uncertainty is reduced, complexity is smoothed. Indigenous politics are simplified. The result is a version of the Caribbean designed for royal imagination. And royal imagination matters. A monarch who believes lands are claimable may send more ships. More ships bring settlers, soldiers, priests, livestock, seeds, tools, weapons, and diseases. A written claim becomes a logistical plan. A description becomes policy. What begins as language becomes movement across the sea.
The first fort, La Navidad, grows from this logic. When the Santa Maria runs aground off Hispaniola in December 1492, Columbus uses its timbers to build a small settlement, leaving men behind when he returns to Spain. The accident becomes an opportunity. A wrecked ship becomes a foothold. The name tied to Christmas wraps the settlement in Christian timing, but its purpose is practical: to hold a place, gather information, seek gold, and mark Spanish presence. The evidence remains incomplete about every detail of what happens among the men left there, but the outcome is grim. By the time Columbus returns on his second voyage, La Navidad has been destroyed, and the Spaniards left behind are dead. Even before that destruction, the fort reveals the shift from visiting to occupying.
The Spaniards are no longer only passing through. They are staying. They are placing themselves inside indigenous territory and expecting the surrounding world to support them. That expectation is itself a claim. It assumes that local food, labor, women, knowledge, and political arrangements can be used to sustain Europeans. When such expectations collide with indigenous autonomy, violence follows almost inevitably. The death of the men at La Navidad will later be framed through Spanish explanations involving disorder, conflict, and indigenous attack. But what survives in the record suggests that the Spaniards themselves likely behaved abusively, taking what they wanted, provoking anger, and misunderstanding the limits of hospitality. The exact sequence is debated, yet the broader lesson is clear. A small group of armed outsiders, left behind with entitlement and hunger, can turn a fragile relationship into bloodshed very quickly. This is how paradise is rewritten as property, not in one dramatic instant, but through a chain of gestures that seem small until they accumulate. A name, a claim, a description, a captive, a fort, a search for gold, a report to the crown, a promise of more. Each act narrows the space for indigenous freedom. Each act makes the next one easier to justify. The island world does not vanish beneath these words immediately. People continue to plant, fish, travel, mourn, negotiate, and resist. Caciques still hold authority. Communities still make choices. But a new layer has been placed over the Caribbean, a paper empire that will soon bring iron consequences. In Europe, the islands are becoming Spanish before Spain has truly conquered them. In the Caribbean, that fiction will have to be enforced. The dark truth is that conquest often begins before the first large army arrives. It begins when outsiders decide that their words matter more than local lives. It begins when a landscape is admired only to be measured. It begins when maps make older worlds disappear, and when royal claims transform hospitality into obligation. Columbus's 1492 voyage carries this transformation in its earliest pages. The islands are described as beautiful, but beauty does not save them. They are praised, named, and claimed, and in that order, one can hear the quiet opening of catastrophe. When Columbus turns back toward Spain, the Atlantic is no longer the same ocean he crossed months before. On the first voyage west, it had been a wall of doubt, a dark corridor between ambition and the unknown. Now it becomes a road of return, carrying not only ships and exhausted men, but a story carefully shaped for power. Columbus must bring back more than survival. He must bring proof. Proof that he has reached valuable lands. Proof that the Spanish monarchs were right to gamble. Proof that the titles and privileges granted to him were not built on fantasy. Proof above all that more ships should follow. The return is dangerous in its own right. Winter storms batter the small vessels. The sea that once seemed to hide land now threatens to erase the evidence of it. Columbus, fearing shipwreck, reportedly prepares accounts of the voyage and seals copies in containers, hoping that if the ship goes down, the news might somehow survive. Whether every detail of this episode is preserved exactly as it happened remains debated. But the image is powerful. A man terrified not only of death, but of losing control of the story. The voyage has meaning only if it reaches the ears of kings. He does not return with the treasure he promised in any overwhelming quantity. There are no great holds full of gold. No spices proving direct access to Asia's markets. No embassy from a mighty Eastern ruler. What he has instead are fragments, small amounts of gold, unfamiliar plants and animals, objects made by islanders, and, most disturbingly, human captives. These captives are made to stand as living evidence. Their bodies become part of the argument. They prove that lands across the Western Ocean are inhabited, reachable, and available for conversion. They also prove, though the court may not wish to see it plainly, that the voyage has already crossed into coercion. In Spain, Columbus's arrival is transformed into spectacle. News spreads quickly.
shaped by wonder and political usefulness. He presents what he has seen, or what he thinks he has seen, to Ferdinand and Isabella. Parrots, ornaments, gold pieces, cotton, and indigenous captives help turn distant islands into something visible. The court can look upon these things and imagine a future empire. The captives, taken from their own world and placed before European power, are forced into the role of proof. Their silence in the archive is almost unbearable. They are present at the heart of the story, yet rarely allowed to speak within it. Columbus's report emphasizes abundance and possibility. The islands are fertile. The people can be converted. Gold exists, and more must be nearby. The lands are beautiful, numerous, and strategically valuable. He still frames them as part of Asia's island fringe, still trapped inside the mistake that made the voyage possible. But the mistake now has momentum. It no longer belongs only to one man's mind. It is entering royal policy, diplomatic rivalry, and European print culture. His famous letter announcing the voyage circulates widely in Europe, translated and printed in different versions. This is a lesser-known but crucial part of the story. The printing press helps turn the voyage into an event of continental imagination. Columbus's words travel faster than ships. They reach readers who will never see the Caribbean, but can now picture it through his descriptions. The islands become fertile, open, rich, and ready for Christian rule. The people become generous, unwarlike, and suitable for conversion. The absence of huge treasure is softened by the promise of future discovery. In print, uncertainty becomes invitation. What survives in the record suggests that Columbus is not merely reporting, he is persuading. He needs continuation. One voyage can be dismissed as a marvel. A second voyage can become colonization. So his account must satisfy multiple hungers at once. To the devout, he offers souls. To monarchs, he offers lands. To merchants, he offers commodities. To rivals of Portugal, he offers strategic advantage. To himself, he offers vindication. The letter is not a neutral window into first contact. It is a promotional document for empire. The Spanish crown responds with speed, because the stakes are enormous. If Columbus has truly reached islands near Asia by sailing west, then Spain has broken Portugal's advantage. But such a claim cannot remain simply a matter of celebration. It must be defended in law and diplomacy. Portugal has its own Atlantic ambitions and will not ignore Spain's sudden claims. The result is a scramble to define possession not only over known islands, but over spaces still barely understood. Lines will soon be drawn across maps with astonishing confidence, dividing oceans and lands that Europeans have not even seen. The Papal Bulls of 1493 and the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 belong to this moment of imperial imagination. They attempt to organize competing Iberian claims by drawing boundaries through the Atlantic world. To modernize, the arrogance is staggering. European powers, backed by religious authority and diplomacy, divide territories inhabited by countless peoples who have no voice in the arrangement. The documents do not instantly create control on the ground, but they create a legal and spiritual framework for future conquest. No single explanation fully accounts for the later shape of empire, but these agreements help reveal the mindset. The world can be partitioned by those with ships, crowns, and pens. Columbus, meanwhile, receives honor. His titles gain substance. The man once dismissed by courts now stands as Admiral of the Ocean Sea, a figure of triumph. Yet the triumph is unstable. He has brought back promises more than wealth. The crown's enthusiasm depends on what future voyages can produce. The captives and objects are enough to excite imagination, not enough to satisfy greed. The next expedition must be larger, more organized, more forceful. Return with promises becomes preparation for occupation. There is a cruel irony in the way evidence works here. The relative lack of gold does not prevent further conquest. It encourages deeper intrusion. If wealth is not lying openly on beaches, then it must be inland. If islanders do not produce it freely, they must be compelled. If the first voyage brings only samples, the second must bring systems. This is how disappointment becomes escalation.
The captives taken to Spain suffer within this machinery. Some are baptized, their conversion used as proof of spiritual success.
Their presence supports the claim that these new subjects can be brought into Christianity and under Spanish authority. But baptism under captivity cannot be understood apart from power. The evidence remains incomplete about their inner experiences, and the record gives them little room as human beings. They are treated as signs of lands reached, signs of souls available, signs of royal destiny. Their forced journey across the Atlantic mirrors the forced journey of meaning itself. As the Caribbean is carried into Europe and transformed into an imperial project, European audiences receive the story through filters of marvel and expectation. The New World is not yet called that in the way it later will be, because Columbus still insists on Asia. But the mental expansion has begun. Suddenly the Western Ocean, once feared as vast and uncertain, contains islands. If it contains islands, it may contain more. If it contains more, then ships must go. The boundary of Europe's ambition moves outward with frightening speed. This movement is not just geographic, it is moral. Once the first voyage is celebrated as a success, its violence is absorbed into glory. The taking of captives becomes a detail. The claiming of inhabited lands becomes ceremony. The misnaming of peoples becomes common language. A dangerous precedent is set. If the outcome is useful to empire, the methods can be softened in memory. Later generations will remember the crossing more readily than the coercion, the courage more readily than the captives, the landfall more readily than the people already living there. But the record still contains shadows. Read carefully. Columbus's success looks uneasy. He has to insist on abundance. He has to promise more gold. He has to interpret island societies as manageable. He has to turn confusion into confidence, because his status depends on it. The voyage is not complete when he reaches Spain. It is being completed in the telling. The Spanish monarchs, newly victorious in Granada and eager to compete with Portugal, are ready to hear what they need. The court sees a chance to extend Christian monarchy across the ocean, to claim lands before rivals do, to open routes, gather wealth, and transform a risky experiment into a royal enterprise. Columbus's promises fit the mood of the age too well to be ignored. And so the first voyage returns not as an ending, but as a seed. It brings back enough truth to prove land exists, enough error to sustain the fantasy of Asia, enough gold to excite greed, enough captives to display conquest, and enough uncertainty to justify going again. Across the Atlantic on Hispaniola, the men left at La Navidad wait inside a fragile and violent foothold. Around them, indigenous communities are already dealing with the consequences of Spanish entitlement. In Spain, meanwhile, ships are being imagined on a larger scale. The dark truth of the return is that proof does not need to be honest to be effective. Columbus brings back a version of the Caribbean that can be used. It is incomplete, distorted, and morally compromised, but it is persuasive. It tells Europe that the ocean can be crossed, that lands can be claimed, that people can be converted or controlled, and that wealth lies just beyond the next voyage. The first crossing has opened the door. The return convinces Spain to walk through it with far more force. The second voyage does not look like the first. The first crossing had carried uncertainty in 3 small ships, a fragile gamble wrapped in royal ambition. The second moves with the weight of decision. 17 ships leave Spain carrying not only sailors but settlers, soldiers, priests, officials, craftsmen, animals, seeds, tools, weapons, and expectations. The ocean is no longer being tested as a possibility. It is being used as a road. What had begun as a voyage has become an invasion in preparation. This is the moment when the story changes shape. Columbus is no longer merely trying to prove that land lies across the Western Sea. He has proved enough for Spain to act. Now the task is to occupy, extract, convert, organize, and defend. The fleet carries the first serious architecture of colonization. Men who expect reward, priests who expect souls, officials who expect order, and a commander who expects his authority to be obeyed. The Caribbean, still misunderstood as the edge of Asia, is about to be forced into a European system that does not require understanding before it begins to command. The scale matters. 17 ships create a different kind of arrival.
To island communities, this is no longer a strange handful of vessels appearing from the horizon. It is a moving settlement. It brings noise, animals, metal, hunger, disease, and a larger confidence. Horses, pigs, cattle, and other European animals begin to enter island ecosystems that have never known them. Even before plantations dominate the future, the biological transformation begins. Pigs can damage gardens. Livestock can alter landscapes. European crops and weeds can travel with settlers. Colonization is not only political, it is ecological. When Columbus returns to Hispaniola, he finds La Navidad destroyed. The men he left behind are dead. The Spanish explanation centers on indigenous hostility, especially the actions of local leaders. But the deeper story is far less flattering to the Europeans. What survives in the record suggests that the men of La Navidad likely abused surrounding communities, seized women, demanded food, quarreled among themselves, and behaved not as guests, but as entitled occupiers. The evidence remains incomplete, and the exact sequence cannot be reconstructed with perfect certainty, but the result is clear. The first Spanish foothold has collapsed in violence. For Columbus, the destruction of La Navidad becomes a justification for firmer control. For the local people, it may have been an act of defense against intolerable behavior. That difference in interpretation matters, because it becomes a pattern. Europeans describe indigenous resistance as treachery or rebellion, while indigenous communities experience Spanish presence as invasion, theft, coercion, and threat. The same event splits into two histories, and the history backed by writing, monarchy, and later empire long dominates the archive. Rather than withdraw, Columbus digs deeper. A new settlement is founded, La Isabela, on the northern coast of Hispaniola. It is often remembered as the first planned European town in the Americas, but it is also a place of misery, almost from the start. The location proves unhealthy. Food shortages appear. Settlers unused to local conditions struggle. Many have come expecting quick wealth, not hard agricultural labor in an unfamiliar tropical environment. They are gentlemen, adventurers, and fortune seekers as much as builders. Their dreams are metallic. Their reality is mud, fever, hunger, and disappointment. This is one of the lesser-known ironies of early colonization. The Spaniards imagine themselves as masters of a new land, yet they are deeply dependent on indigenous knowledge and food. Without local crops, local labor, local paths, and local guides, they are vulnerable. But instead of recognizing dependence as a reason for humility, they often turn it into coercion. If food is needed, it is demanded. If labor is needed, it is imposed. If gold is not found in sufficient quantity, people are forced into tribute systems that make survival harder for everyone. Columbus's authority also begins to crack among his own people. The skills needed to cross an ocean are not the same as those needed to govern a colony. At sea, his stubborn certainty had carried the voyage forward. On land, that same stubbornness becomes dangerous. He must manage sickness, resentment, hunger, competing ambitions, indigenous diplomacy, Spanish expectations, and his own promises of wealth. No single explanation fully accounts for the failures of his governorship, but the pattern is unmistakable. Columbus is far better at imagining empire than administering human reality. The second voyage brings priests, and with them, the formal expansion of Christian mission. Conversion is presented as a central purpose of Spain's presence. Yet conversion unfolds alongside forced labor and violence, creating a contradiction that will trouble some Spanish observers, even in their own time. Christianity is offered as salvation, but too often carried by men demanding gold. Baptism is described as spiritual care, but the surrounding system treats indigenous bodies as labor and indigenous lands as royal property. The dark truth is not that religion was fake for everyone involved. Many truly believed in conversion. The darkness lies in how easily sincere belief
could travel with domination. Gold remains the fever at the center. Columbus explores the interior of Hispaniola, hears of mines and river deposits, and pushes for systems to extract wealth. Settlers expect riches. The crown expects tribute.
Columbus must prove the colony can pay for itself. When gold does not appear in the imagined abundance, pressure falls on indigenous communities. They are required to provide gold dust or cotton and to serve Spanish needs. Later accounts describe tribute demands marked by tokens and punishments, a system that transforms daily life into a struggle under impossible expectations. Scholars still debate exact numbers, timelines, and local variations, but the direction is not in doubt. The search for gold becomes organized coercion. Violence grows. Spanish expeditions move inland. Alliances form and break. Some caciques attempt diplomacy, calculating how to survive the newcomers. Others resist. Still others are caught between rival indigenous and Spanish pressures.
The Caribbean political world is not passive, but the balance is shifting brutally. Steel weapons, horses, attack dogs, armor, and European military tactics create terror disproportionate to numbers. Even when Spaniards are few, their violence can be spectacular and strategic, designed to break resistance and produce obedience. Attack dogs are among the most chilling details of early conquest. Large mastiffs and other war dogs, brought by Europeans, become instruments of intimidation and killing. To communities unfamiliar with such animals used in war, they must have seemed horrifying. Their presence reminds us that conquest is not only fought by men with swords, it is fought through every tool that can turn fear into control.
And still disease moves in the background, sometimes invisibly at first. Sustained contact makes epidemics more likely. The full catastrophe will unfold over years and decades, with smallpox later playing a devastating role across the Americas. But even early illness weakens communities. Disease does not act alone. It works with hunger, displacement, forced labor, warfare, and social breakdown. To blame collapse only on germs is to let human violence hide behind biology. To ignore disease is also false. The horror lies in combination. The second voyage also changes the Caribbean's future by bringing European women only in very limited numbers, creating a colony dominated by armed men hungry for wealth and status. This imbalance contributes to abuse, sexual violence, forced relationships, and social disorder. The archive often covers these realities with euphemism or silence, but the consequences are visible in conflict and demographic trauma. Indigenous women become targets within the colonial system, valued as labor, translators, companions, and objects of domination. The violence of conquest enters households as well as battlefields. La Isabela struggles, but its failure does not end colonization. That is another dark lesson. Early colonies can be miserable, unhealthy, and economically disappointing, yet still survive as projects, because imperial desire is stronger than evidence, or failure becomes reason to reorganize, not reason to leave. Settlers blame indigenous people, climate, leadership, distance, or lack of discipline, but the basic claim remains. Spain has crossed the ocean, and it will not easily uncross it. Columbus sends people back to Spain, including indigenous captives. Some are enslaved outright. He argues for their use and sale, especially when gold disappoints. The Crown's position on indigenous enslavement shifts and develops over time, sometimes restricting, sometimes permitting, under certain categories, especially against those labeled hostile or cannibal. The legal history is complicated and often contradictory, but on the ground, violence moves faster than law. People are seized, transported, and forced into labor long before moral debates can protect them. The second voyage's shadow is therefore the shadow of permanence. The first voyage could still be imagined as contact, however distorted. The second creates conditions for domination to continue, even when individuals die, settlements fail, and promises sour. It brings infrastructure, animals, weapons,
religious mission, and administrative ambition. It turns the Caribbean into a testing ground for patterns that will later spread across the Americas. Claim, settle, demand tribute, punish resistance, exploit divisions, impose Christianity, extract labor, and explain the damage as destiny. Columbus stands at the center of this transformation, but he is also increasingly trapped by it. His promises have created expectations he cannot satisfy.
His title makes him powerful, but his failures make him vulnerable. His colony needs food, but his men seek gold. His faith speaks of salvation, but his policies produce suffering. The world he claimed so easily in words now resists him in reality. For the indigenous peoples of Hispaniola and the surrounding islands, the second voyage marks the arrival of a future far heavier than the first ship suggested. What once appeared as strange visitors becomes an occupying force. What once might have been managed through exchange becomes a demand backed by violence. The horizon, once a place where canoes and weather came from, now delivers fleets. The dark truth is that 1492 does not become catastrophic simply because Columbus lands. It becomes catastrophic because Europe returns. It returns with memory, plans, reinforcements, animals, weapons, hunger, and a story that says the land is already claimed. The second voyage is the moment that story begins to harden into colonial reality. The collapse does not arrive as a single blow. It comes as a tightening circle made of sickness, hunger, fear, forced labor, broken authority, and grief, spreading from village to village, faster than any one person can understand. Later histories often search for one dominant cause, one clean explanation that can be named and contained: disease, violence, enslavement, war. But the catastrophe that falls upon the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean is not clean. It is a convergence. No single explanation fully accounts for it, because the destruction comes from several directions at once, each one making the others worse. Disease is the most invisible at first, and perhaps the most terrifying, because no one in the Caribbean can see it coming. The people of the islands have their own illnesses and healing traditions, their own knowledge of plants, fevers, wounds, childbirth, and ritual care. But they have not lived for centuries within the crowded disease environments of Europe, Africa, and Asia, where smallpox, measles, influenza, and other infections circulate through dense populations and domestic animals. When sustained contact begins, pathogens cross the ocean with sailors, settlers, animals, clothing, breath, and touch. They do not need permission.
They do not need armies. They move through kinship itself, through the care given to the sick, through the closeness of households and villages. Yet disease alone cannot explain what happens. And to pretend it can is to make conquest look like an accident of biology. Epidemics become far more deadly when people are already weakened by hunger, displacement, terror, and forced labor. A community forced to produce food for strangers has less food for itself. A village whose people are compelled to search rivers for gold cannot tend gardens with the same rhythm. A family mourning captives or the dead cannot easily maintain planting cycles, ceremonies, alliances, and protection. The body weakens under empire before the fever arrives, and when fever comes, it finds societies already wounded.
Spanish violence is direct and deliberate. Expeditions punish resistance. Dogs, swords, crossbows, firearms, and horses create shock. The horse, so ordinary in Europe, is a terrifying military technology in the Caribbean at first contact. A mounted man becomes taller, faster, and harder to confront. Steel cuts through materials never designed to meet it. Armor protects bodies in ways unfamiliar to island warfare. Attack dogs turn pursuit into horror. What survives in the record suggests that Spanish violence is not random alone but often exemplary, meant to teach submission through fear. A few acts of extreme brutality can echo across many communities. The tribute system deepens the disaster. On Hispaniola,
indigenous people are forced to deliver gold or cotton under Spanish demands.
In regions where gold is scarce or hard to obtain, the demand becomes impossible. People must leave gardens, travel to rivers, search for dust and flakes, and return with quantities that satisfy men who believe wealth is being hidden from them. Failure brings punishment. Even when exact details vary in the sources, the broader reality is clear. Spanish. Expectations are placed upon indigenous labor systems that were never built to serve them. The result is exhaustion and social breakdown. Hunger follows. Gardens do not plant themselves. Cassava requires time, skill, and processing. Fishing requires access, movement, and safety. Communities under tribute pressure lose the freedom to organize life around seasons and need. When people flee Spanish control, fields may be abandoned. When warfare disrupts roots, exchange suffers. When leaders are killed, humiliated, or co-opted, redistribution falters. Famine does not always look like empty land. Sometimes it looks like a living landscape, whose human rhythms have been violently interrupted. Columbus and the Spaniards often interpret flight or resistance as defiance, but from the indigenous side, it can be survival. People retreat into mountains, forests, and less accessible regions. They attempt to avoid tribute, violence, and seizure. Some destroy crops rather than let Spaniards take them. Some form alliances, some fight, some negotiate. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because indigenous voices are filtered through hostile or paternalistic accounts. But resistance is constant. The myth of passive disappearance is false. People do not simply vanish. They are pushed, hunted, sickened, enslaved, and still they make choices under impossible conditions. The demographic collapse of Hispaniola becomes one of the most devastating in recorded history. Estimates of the pre-contact population vary widely, and scholars still debate the numbers because early counts are unreliable, politically shaped, and often made after destruction was already underway. Some older estimates were extremely high, others lower, and modern scholarship remains cautious. But uncertainty over exact numbers should not blur the reality of catastrophe. Within decades, the indigenous population of Hispaniola is reduced by an overwhelming proportion. Communities that had filled valleys, coasts, and river systems are shattered. Entire lineages disappear from the record. Others survive only through absorption, flight, intermarriage, or hidden continuity. The Spanish demand for labor adapts as the population collapses, which makes the tragedy even darker. As indigenous workers die or flee, colonists intensify control over those who remain and increasingly turn toward the forced importation of enslaved Africans. The Caribbean becomes one of the early centers of a brutal Atlantic system that will expand massively in later centuries. The suffering of indigenous peoples and Africans is not the same story, but the two are historically linked by European hunger for labor, land, and export wealth. When one exploited population is devastated, empire does not stop. It searches for another. Religious language continues to move through the violence. Priests baptize, preach, criticize, defend, and sometimes protest. Figures such as Bartolomé de las Casas will later condemn Spanish brutality with searing force, though his own early positions and later proposals are complex and morally troubling in their own ways. The Spanish world is not without debate. Some observers are horrified by what conquest produces, but for the people suffering in the Caribbean, debate often arrives too late, and law travels more slowly than greed. A royal order can sound humane across the ocean and still fail on a riverbank where a colonist demands labor. The encomienda system becomes one of the central structures of exploitation. In theory, Spanish holders receive the right to indigenous labor and tribute while owing protection and Christian instruction. In practice, it often becomes forced labor under another name. The language of care masks extraction. The people assigned to Spaniards are not free in any meaningful sense. Their work feeds colonists, mines gold, builds settlements, and sustains the very system that is destroying them. What survives in the record suggests a familiar colonial pattern. Legal categories soften the appearance of violence without ending it. Sexual violence and forced unions also tear through the social fabric. Indigenous women are seized, pressured, or drawn into relationships shaped by extreme imbalance.
Some become translators or intermediaries. Some become mothers of mixed descent children. Some become captives. Some become survivors, navigating the least terrible path available. The archive rarely gives them the dignity of full interior lives. Yet their experiences are central to the formation of colonial society. Conquest enters not only fields and minds, but bodies, households, inheritance, language, and memory. Children grow up in a world changing too quickly to hold. Elders die before knowledge can be passed on. Ritual specialists lose communities. Caciques are forced to choose between negotiation and resistance, both dangerous. Sacred objects may be hidden, destroyed, or reinterpreted. Names shift. Languages begin to fracture under pressure. This is cultural violence as well as physical destruction. A society can lose people and then lose the conditions that allow its stories to continue intact, and still survival persists. This must be said carefully, because survival should never be used to soften catastrophe. The losses are immense, but the colonial claim that the Taino and other indigenous Caribbean peoples simply vanished is too convenient. It allows later societies to inherit land without inheriting responsibility. It turns descendants into impossibilities. In reality, indigenous ancestry, practices, words, foods, and identities continue in complicated forms across the Caribbean. Cassava bread, place names, agricultural knowledge, genetic inheritance, and revived indigenous identities all testify that erasure was never complete. Scholars still debate the lines of continuity, but the older story of total disappearance has broken under the weight of evidence and memory. The collapse of the early Caribbean world is therefore not an ending in the simple sense. It is a violent transformation. The old structures are broken, populations devastated, and sovereignty crushed. Yet fragments survive and move forward. They survive in people who adapt, hide, intermarry, remember, forget for safety, and later remember again. They survive in landscapes, still carrying indigenous names, beneath Spanish, English, French, and Dutch overlays. They survive in the foods that feed the colonizers, and outlast them. For Columbus, the catastrophe begins during his governorship, and continues beyond his direct control. He is not the only cause, but he is deeply implicated. His policies, his demands for gold, his acceptance and practice of enslavement, his punishments, his inability to govern without coercion, and his insistence on seeing the islands as resources, all help set the disaster in motion. Later empires will expand the violence far beyond him, but the first pattern is visible in his Caribbean. The dark truth behind 1492 is not only that many people died, it is that they died in a world that was being deliberately reorganized to serve outsiders. Disease entered through contact, but forced labor carried people into danger. Violence killed directly, but hunger weakened those who survived. Colonization shattered leadership, but Spanish law then blamed indigenous people for disorder. Every part of the system pressed upon the next. By the time the scale of the collapse becomes undeniable, the language of discovery has already done its work. Europe has learned to remember the opening of the Atlantic as achievement. The dead are pushed to the margins of the story, treated as tragic background to the birth of a new age. But from the Caribbean shore, the age looks different. It looks like canoes pulled up beside villages that no longer answer. It looks like gardens gone wild because the hands that tended them are gone. It looks like a sacred object hidden in fear. It looks like a child learning a new language because the old one has become dangerous. The collapse is not a shadow beside the story. It is the story. The voyage of 1492 cannot be separated from the world it helped destroy, nor from the people who endured its aftermath. The ships that once appeared small against the Atlantic carried forces larger than their own hulls, pathogens, hunger, law, ambition, iron, and a way of seeing that turned human societies into obstacles before it understood them as neighbors. The myth of Columbus does not form all at once. It gathers slowly, like varnish over a damaged painting, until the darker shapes underneath become harder to see. At first, he is celebrated because he seems useful, the admiral who crossed the ocean, the man who opened a western route, the servant of monarchs, the bearer of Christian possibility, the figure whose voyage proves Spain can compete on a global stage. Later, as centuries pass, he becomes something broader and less human. He becomes a symbol of courage, discovery, destiny, and beginnings. The more symbolic he becomes, the less room there is for the people he harmed. This is how historical memory often works. It does not only preserve, it selects, it polishes, it removes inconvenient weight. A ship on the horizon is easier to admire than a tribute system. A brave crossing is easier to teach than forced labor. A moment of landfall is easier to paint than epidemic collapse. The voyage of 1492 becomes a clean image. 3 ships, a bold commander, a new world waiting in sunlight. But the real history is not clean. It is filled with miscalculation, captivity, coercion, hunger, disease, and indigenous societies forced into a catastrophe they did not create. The phrase, discovery, carries much of this distortion. It sounds simple, but it hides a question of perspective. Columbus did not discover lands unknown to their inhabitants. He did not discover an empty world. He did not even understand where he was. What he did was reveal the Caribbean to European imperial systems that then transformed contact into conquest. From Europe's perspective, 192 opened a new geographical awareness. From the perspective of indigenous peoples, it opened a new era of invasion. Both statements describe aspects of the event, but only one became the older public myth. Scholars still debate how best to use the word discovery, because language can preserve older assumptions even when historians try to correct them. Some avoid the word entirely, others use it only with explanation. The problem is not merely political sensitivity, it is accuracy. A word that places Europe at the center and turns everyone else into scenery cannot fully describe what happened. The evidence remains incomplete in many details, but it is complete enough to show that the world Columbus entered was already inhabited, named, cultivated, traveled, defended, and remembered. The heroic Columbus of later memory is also built on another falsehood, the idea that he alone defied a world of flat earthers. This story is powerful because it flatters modern audiences. It turns Columbus into reason battling superstition. But educated Europeans in his time generally understood the earth was spherical. The serious debate concerned the size of the ocean and the distance to Asia. Columbus was not the lone genius who knew the earth was round. He was the stubborn advocate of a dangerously small earth. His success came not because his geography was correct, but because the Americas lay in the way. This matters because the false flat earth myth rescues him from a more troubling truth. If his opponents were fools, then his confidence looks enlightened. If his opponents were often closer to the truth about distance, then his confidence looks reckless. The myth turns error into genius. It transforms accident into destiny. It allows the story to be told as the triumph of knowledge, when in fact, one of its central engines was misjudgment. The myth also softens Columbus's own actions. Captives become interpreters. Claims become ceremonies. Forced labor becomes settlement. Violence becomes conflict. Enslavement becomes a regrettable detail, rather than a central feature of the emerging system. The language is gentle, but the reality is not. Columbus took people against their will, demanded gold, imposed tribute, supported enslavement under certain conditions, and governed with cruelty severe enough that even the Spanish crown eventually removed him from authority. That removal did not undo the damage.
but it shows that his conduct was controversial even within the brutal standards of his own world.
And yet, the myth survives because it serves needs beyond history. For Spain, Columbus becomes part of imperial origin. For later European powers, he becomes a marker of transatlantic transformation. For some immigrant communities in the United States centuries later, especially Italian Americans facing discrimination, Columbus becomes a symbol of dignity, belonging, and contribution. This later use is historically understandable in its own context, but it also complicates memory. A man can become meaningful to people for reasons far removed from his actual deeds. Symbols often carry the hopes of those who adopt them, even when the historical figure beneath the symbol remains deeply troubling.
No single explanation fully accounts for why Columbus became so celebrated, because his legend serves many audiences. He can be made into a Catholic hero, a Spanish imperial hero, an Italian hero, an American pioneer, a navigator of genius, a symbol of Western expansion, or a convenient starting point for schoolbook history. Each version emphasizes some details and hides others. The real Columbus, with his errors and cruelties, is too jagged for such uses, so the legend sands him down. Paintings and monuments help do this work. They freeze the story at its most flattering instant. The landing, the raised banner, the grateful or astonished indigenous figures, the kneeling sailors, the bright shore.
These images often place Columbus at the center, upright and commanding, while indigenous people appear as witnesses to European arrival, rather than inhabitants of their own world.
The composition tells the viewer who matters, even without words. The myth teaches hierarchy. Schoolbooks then repeat simplified versions. Children learn names of ships before they learn names of Caribbean peoples. They learn dates before consequences. They learn that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but not always that his arrival helped unleash forced labor, enslavement, and demographic collapse. A rhyme is easier than a reckoning. The result is memory without proportion. But the myth has never gone uncontested. Indigenous voices, Caribbean scholars, critical historians, activists, and many others have challenged the heroic version for generations. They ask what it means to celebrate arrival while mourning what followed. They point out that the so-called New World was only new to Europeans. They insist that survival, resistance, and loss must stand at the center of the story, not at its margins. What survives in the record, when read carefully, and alongside archaeology, oral memory, and later testimony, supports this challenge. The older myth is not merely incomplete, it is morally misleading. Still, replacing myth with history is not as simple as turning Columbus from hero into monster. That would be another kind of simplification, though a more understandable one.
The deeper task is to see him clearly as a man of his world whose choices helped make a more violent world possible. He was brave at sea. He was skilled enough to cross the Atlantic and return. He was also greedy, coercive, and often disastrously wrong. He was not the only cause of empire, but he became one of its opening agents. History can hold all of this at once, even if monuments cannot. The myth of discovery collapses when the camera widens. It must include the Taino farmer processing cassava before the ships arrive. It must include the canoe routes between islands. It must include the captive taken across the ocean as proof. It must include the village pressed for gold that does not exist in the demanded quantity. It must include the disease moving invisibly through households. It must include the Spanish settler starving in a colony built on fantasy. It must include the royal court hearing promises that turn uncertainty into policy. It must include descendants who refuse to be erased. That wider view does not make the story smaller, it makes it more powerful. The real 1492 is not less dramatic than the myth. It is more dramatic because it is filled with human consequence. The old heroic tale depends on narrowing the frame until suffering falls outside it. The truth requires letting the frame expand until the ships are small again, as they truly were, and the world they entered becomes vast.
In that larger world, Columbus's voyage is not the birth of history in the Americas. It is a collision between histories.
European history crosses the Atlantic and meets indigenous histories, already thousands of times. Years deep. The tragedy is that one side arrives with the power to write the first widely circulated account, and then to enforce that account with ships, law, and violence. The myth begins there, in the unequal power to describe. The dark truth behind the Columbus legend is that it teaches people how to look away. It asks them to admire the sail and ignore the chain. It asks them to celebrate the map and ignore the village. It asks them to remember the admiral's courage and forget the captive's fear. But history, when followed honestly, keeps returning to what the myth excludes. And once those excluded lives return to the center, the word discovery no longer sounds innocent.
It sounds like a door opening from one side only, while the people on the other side are forced to pay the price of being found. What the archives cannot hold is often the very thing most needed to understand the story. The surviving record of Columbus's voyage is full of dates, claims, descriptions, royal permissions, petitions, letters, summaries, accusations, defenses, and later histories. It gives the impression of solidity, as if the past has been pinned down by ink. Yet the closer one moves toward the indigenous side of 1492, the more the record thins, breaks, and turns painfully one-sided. The people most transformed by the voyage are the people least allowed to speak inside the alleged documents that made the voyage famous. This silence is not emptiness, it is damage.
The Taino and other Caribbean peoples had memory, law, diplomacy, spiritual knowledge, place names, genealogies, and history, but they did not preserve them in the same written forms that European archives privileged. Much was carried orally, ritually, materially, and through landscape. When conquest shattered communities, killed elders, displaced families, destroyed sacred objects, and forced conversion, it also attacked the systems that carried memory forward. A burned house can be rebuilt. A broken chain of transmission is harder to repair. The European archive records what Europeans noticed, feared, desired, and justified. It preserves Columbus's search for gold more clearly than a Taino mother's fear when a child was taken. It preserves arguments over titles and profits more clearly than the grief of a village after epidemic disease. It preserves the names of Spanish commanders more readily than the names of those forced into tribute. This imbalance is not a small technical problem. It shapes the moral architecture of the story. Scholars still debate many details because the evidence remains incomplete. The exact island of first landfall, the population of Hispaniola before contact, the meaning of certain indigenous words recorded by Europeans, the sequence of some conflicts, the degree of continuity between pre-contact communities and later Caribbean identities. These debates matter, but uncertainty should not be misused to deny catastrophe. The record can be incomplete and still unmistakably violent. A ruined house does not need every missing object catalogued to prove a storm passed through. To recover indigenous perspectives, historians must read against the grain. A Spanish complaint about resistance may reveal indigenous defense. A missionary condemnation of spiritual practice may preserve traces of belief. A distorted place name may carry the echo of an older geography. Archaeology adds what documents omit: settlement patterns, tools, burials, food remains, pottery, plazas, trade objects, and environmental traces. None of these speaks in a simple voice, but together they push back against the old colonial claim that the Caribbean had no deep history before Europe arrived. There is a strange tenderness in some of these surviving traces. A carved zemi, worn smooth by hands long gone. A cassava griddle found in the soil. A shell ornament. A burial placed with care. A village site near fresh water and gardens. These things do not tell the whole story, but they refuse disappearance. They say that people made meaning here, fed one another here, honored the dead here, and knew the land in ways Columbus never did. The archive cannot hold the first moment an islander saw the ships and tried to decide what they meant. It cannot hold the tone of the warnings passed from canoe to canoe. It cannot hold the private calculations of a cacique weighing diplomacy against resistance. It cannot hold the dreams of captives carried eastward over the Atlantic. It cannot hold the last full telling of a story that died with an elder during epidemic sickness. But absence is not nothing.
It is a reminder that conquest destroys evidence as well as lives. This is why the history of 1492 must be told with humility. Not uncertainty that excuses violence, but humility that recognizes the limits of surviving sources. Columbus's words are valuable because they are close to the events, but they are also compromised by ambition, misunderstanding, and self-justification. Later Spanish accounts may preserve details, yet they often write from within the world conquest created. Even critics of Spanish cruelty can carry assumptions of conversion, empire, and European superiority. Every source must be handled carefully, not worshipped as a clear window. The dark truth is that the archive itself is part of the conquest. It does not merely describe power, it was produced by power.
Royal paperwork made claims official. Reports turned lands into assets. Lists of tribute turned human suffering into administration. Legal categories decided who could be enslaved, protected, punished, or converted. Writing helped empire remember what it wanted and forget what it damaged. Yet memory survives outside the archive. It survives in Caribbean families who carry indigenous ancestry despite centuries of denial. It survives in foodways, words, farming practices, place names, craft traditions, and renewed movements of Taino identity. These survivals are complex, and scholars still debate how to trace them responsibly. But they matter because they challenge the old sentence that indigenous Caribbean peoples vanished completely. Vanishing is often what colonizers call survival when they no longer wish to recognize it. To look honestly at what the archives cannot hold is to see Columbus differently. He is no longer simply the author of the first European chapter. He is also a producer of silences. His reports make some things visible, and others nearly disappear. He records generosity, but not its full meaning. He records gold, but not the world gold disrupts. He records people as useful before he records them as sovereign. The archive gives him a voice large enough to cross centuries, while many of those he encountered remain present only through fragments. And still those fragments are enough to trouble the legend. They remind us that the Caribbean was never a blank page. It was a library of lived knowledge. Much of it burned, scattered, buried, or forced into hiding. The tragedy is not only that Europeans misunderstood this library, it is that they often did not believe it counted as knowledge at all. So the story moves forward, carrying gaps that cannot be closed. The missing voices are not decorative losses, they are central. They make the history harder, slower, and more honest. They ask the listener to imagine not fantasies, but limits. The limits of documents, the limits of conquest memory, the limits of any story told mainly by those who arrived with claims. What remains, then, is a task of careful reconstruction, to hold Columbus's words up to the light and see both what they show and what they hide, to place archaeology beside text, to place indigenous survival beside colonial declarations of disappearance, to place grief beside glory, and to understand that the silence in the record is not a pause in history. It is where history was wounded. The afterlife of 1492 is longer than the voyage itself, longer than Columbus's career, longer than the first Spanish settlements that struggled and rotted in the Caribbean heat. It stretches outward through centuries of empire, slavery, resistance, migration, memory, monuments, schoolbooks, protests, and arguments over what a society chooses to honor. A crossing that lasted weeks becomes a historical turning point that still refuses to settle, quietly. The ships have long since vanished, but the wake remains. For Europe, the voyage opens a new age of expansion. Spain moves first in the Caribbean, then across mainland empires and vast interior worlds it can scarcely comprehend. Portugal, England, France, the Netherlands, and others follow in different ways, each carrying its own forms of ambition, violence, trade, religion, and settlement. The Atlantic becomes not a border, but a system. Ships carry silver, sugar, tobacco, timber, people, weapons, animals, seeds, and diseases. The ocean that once frightened Columbus's crew becomes one of the busiest and most brutal corridors in human history. The consequences are enormous, because 1492 helps connect worlds that had developed separately for thousands of years. Plants and animals move across oceans in what later scholars call the Columbian Exchange. Maize, potatoes, cassava, tomatoes, cacao, and peppers reshaped diets far beyond the Americas. Wheat, sugarcane, cattle, horses, pigs, and coffee transform American landscapes. This exchange is not simply a story of food and farming. It is also a story of ecological upheaval, forced labor, plantation economies, and demographic catastrophe. A potato field in Europe, a sugar estate in the Caribbean, and a silver mine in the Andes, all belong in different ways to the long afterlife of the first crossing. For indigenous peoples, that afterlife is marked by loss, but also by endurance. The old myth says disappearance. The deeper record says survival under pressure. Across the Caribbean and the wider Americas, indigenous communities resist, adapt, flee, negotiate, revolt, rebuild, and remember. Some survivors reconstitute nations. Others survive through mixed communities, hidden practices, place names, foods, bloodlines, and revivals of identity after centuries of denial. The evidence remains incomplete in many places, and scholars still debate specific lines of continuity, but the older story of total erasure is no longer strong enough to hold the truth. Columbus himself does not end as the unchallenged hero his legend later suggests. His governorship becomes chaotic and cruel. Complaints reach Spain. He is eventually arrested and sent back in chains, though he later regains some favor. He dies, still clinging to the belief that he has reached regions connected to Asia, still arguing over titles and privileges, still unable or unwilling to understand the full geography his voyage revealed. There is a strange smallness in that ending. The man, attached to one of the largest transformations in world history, dies inside his own misreading. But symbols do not need accurate men beneath them. Over time, Columbus becomes larger than Columbus. Statues rise. Holidays are named. Streets and cities carry his memory. He is made to stand for discovery, courage, immigration, Western civilization, and national origin stories. Yet every monument casts a shadow. For many indigenous peoples and their allies, Columbus represents not noble beginnings but invasion, enslavement, land theft, and the start of a catastrophe still felt in law, poverty, memory, and identity. No single explanation fully accounts for the intensity of the modern debate, because the debate is not only about the 15th century, it is about whose pain counts as history. This is why 1492 still matters. It is not trapped in the past. It lives in arguments over museums, classrooms, public squares, and national memory. It lives in whether children learn the names of ships before they learn the names of the Taino. It lives in whether discovery is spoken without hesitation, or whether the word is opened and examined. It lives in whether survival is recognized, where empire once declared extinction. The dark truth behind his voyage, is not that courage and brutality cannot exist in the same story. They can, and often do. The truth is that courage has too often been used to hide brutality. The Atlantic crossing was daring. It was also disastrous in its consequences. Columbus was skilled enough to cross an ocean and blind enough to misunderstand the world he reached. Europe gained roots, wealth, and power. Indigenous peoples paid with land, labor, life, and memory. And still, the story is not only darkness. If it were, it would be simpler. The long afterlife of 1492 also contains resistance, survival, scholarship, recovery, and the refusal of descendants to be spoken of only in the past tense.
It contains the difficult work of changing memory without pretending history can be undone. It contains the possibility of looking at the old painted scene on the beach and finally seeing not only the man with the flag, but the people watching from their own homeland, already standing inside histories far older than his arrival. The voyage begins with a man chasing Asia and ends with the world changed because he was wrong. That wrongness becomes empire. That empire becomes legend. That legend becomes argument. And beneath all of it, the islands remain green, bright, wounded, alive, still carrying names older than conquest, still holding traces of those who saw the ships coming in from the sea. The window ends where the voyage began, with the sea. Not the sea of maps and claims, not the Atlantic divided by royal lines and imperial ambition, but the older sea, moving before any sail crossed it, breathing against islands that already had names. Long after the ships are gone, the water keeps returning to the shore. It covers footprints. It polishes broken shell. It carries canoes, storms, wreckage, memory, and silence. It does not explain itself. It simply remains. The story of Columbus's 1492 voyage is often told as a beginning, but beginnings depend on where one stands. For Europe, it opens a door. For the Caribbean, it breaks one. For the people already living among those islands, the moment is not the arrival of history, but the arrival of a force that will try to rename history in its own image. That is why the truth feels so heavy. The crossing is real. The courage is real. The skill at sea is real. But so are the captives, the claims, the hunger for gold, the tribute, the disease, the violence, and the long attempt to make whole peoples appear smaller than the man who misunderstood them. Time has not erased the beach. It has only made it harder to see clearly. The old paintings still show flags and sunlight, but behind them now stand other images. Gardens left untended, villages emptied, sacred objects hidden, children learning to survive inside a changing world, descendants carrying fragments that empire failed to destroy. The evidence remains incomplete, as all human evidence eventually does. But incompleteness is not emptiness. It is an invitation to listen more carefully. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson left behind by 1492.
Civilizations are not fragile only because enemies arrive with weapons. They are fragile because memory can be taken. Names can be overwritten. Suffering can be turned into a footnote beneath someone else's triumph. Yet memory can also return. It can rise through food, language, ancestry, land, scholarship, resistance, and the simple refusal to vanish. So the ships fade back into distance. The Atlantic darkens. The island trees move in the warm air. Somewhere beneath the later names, older names remain, like roots under stone. The sea keeps touching the shore again and again, as if smoothing the edge between loss and survival. And the final image is not of discovery, but of a world that was already there, watching the horizon before the sails appeared.